Isn't it interesting, Summer, that after all that stuff we just did, nothing really mattered and there was no point to it?
Nobody exists on purpose. Nobody belongs anywhere. Everybody's gonna die. Come watch TV.
If you've been watching this show for any length of time, you know that this is the central theme of the show. Nothing matters. Or rather, it was. For a really, really long time, the show insisted that this was the story it was going to tell. But then, something unexpected happened. As the show entered its 7th season, the show blossomed into something new, different, needed for the longevity of the show. Let me explain what I mean. Super fast pitch. Morty is a 14-year-old boy who is dragged by his drunk grandpa on fantastical space adventures while his sister Summer does teenage girl things, his dad stays unemployed, and his mom and his mom's clone work through their concerns about their place in the world. Rick and Morty is a very, very simple to understand concept, but that doesn't mean it lacks substance. A lot of these adventures deal with deep interpersonal problems about connecting with others, what being there for family means, and questions about mortality. Other adventures rely more on classic sci-fi fiction tropes and concepts, even satirizing them through the fourth wall.
Are you doing a Die Hard?
Maybe.
As early as Season 1, Episode 2, the show poses questions about intelligent quotients between pets and animals. 1-6 has probably the most pivotal moment in the entire show, with Morty facing burying his own body as he switches dimensions, leaving behind everything he once knew. 2-2 leads Morty to committing murder to save the galaxy, and opens questions about what kind of people get imprisoned, for what, and is it justified. 2-8 raises questions about bodily autonomy in regards to medical procedures. 3-6 gives us really great insight into what kind of parts of people can be quantified as toxic or negative, and what that means for the rest of the person. 5-3 talks about environmental concerns and profiteering off of them. 5-10 gives us the central finite curve, which is its own damn topic of discussion, but I think I've illustrated my point. Rick and Morty makes you think. Or it can, if you're inclined to think deeper about the topics that are being posed. At the end of the day, Jerry refusing to give his penis to an alien activist is just funny regardless of what you engage with on a deeper level. Those of you who understand the themes and philosophies of Rick and Morty may have noticed there was one philosophy that I specifically didn't mention yet, but don't worry, we're going to be talking about it for basically the rest of the video. Nihilism. Nihilism is the philosophical belief that life is without objective meaning, purpose, or intrinsic value. In layman's terms, it's the belief that nothing matters. And I think it's tainted Rick and Morty for at least a while. Seasons 6, 7, and 8 have really moved the show in a better and healthier way regarding this philosophy, but it's important to establish our baseline and understand this scale of nihilism that we'll be talking about, because if you know you're looking for it, you'll find it everywhere. So we're going to talk through the show real fast and talk about all the places you've seen it, and how engaging with this philosophy has damaged the show overall. Chances are you've noticed it too, just on a casual watch, but you maybe didn't have the words to describe it. When I say it's everywhere, we're talking like every other episode, dudes. Let's get cracking. This concept is one that the show was able to start off very early, in 1-6. Morty leaves behind his home dimension, and Rick insists that there are an infinite amount of universes to travel to, and that the going-ons of any particular one is pointless to care about. Meaningless. This element permutates nearly every episode in some way from this point moving forward, but some episodes are particularly plagued by it. So first, let's really dive into 1-6. The episode is about Morty asking Rick to make him a love potion to give Jessica so she falls for him. It's flu season, so it spreads to everyone, and Rick turns the entire planet into Cronenberg monsters in an attempt to fix it. Being unable to actually fix the problem, Rick comes up with the solution of jumping to another reality where the Rick did fix it, but dies shortly after along with his Morty. Upon arriving, they grab shovels and bury themselves, leaving Morty to sit with it. Now on the surface, first pool of thought, this isn't necessarily nihilistic. Morty jumping from the Prime universe and taking the place of C-131 isn't nihilistic on its own, but this was the first time in the series that a broader multiverse was established. Obviously this would be pivotal in what I would describe as the central plot of Rick and Morty, being the hunt for Rick Prime. But this also lays the groundwork for the nihilistic attitudes that take root in the show. Take this part of the conversation.
What about the reality we left behind?
What about the reality where Hitler cured cancer, Morty? The answer is don't think about it.
Firstly, fuck you, I will think about it. Secondly, Rick is attempting to hide behind a shield of absurdism. Absurdism is a neighboring philosophy to nihilism. Absurdism also has the universe is cold and meaningless as its cornerstone, but the difference is that it ascribes the human condition as one that desires meaning and purpose. It essentially puts nihilism at odds with the human spirit. Albert Camus, you see he's French, so it's a French name, it's pronounced Camus, one of the people responsible for absurdism's rise circa 1940, wrote about the 3 solutions to this nihilistic realization. 1. Physical suicide. If the world is meaningless, why live in it? 2. Philosophical suicide. Essentially turning to religion or dogma to provide you a path forward through the meaningless. That's technically what Rick is doing in this moment. Don't think about it as a simple dogma that he's hinging on instead of actually engaging with this hypothetical. And lastly, defiance. If life is meaningless and nothing matters, then nothing matters, am I right? YOLO that shit. Morty at this point is stuck in that first phase, simple nihilism, processing that there are an infinite amount of universes and an infinite amount of Rick and Mortys. Absurdism acts as a way to engage with nihilism, but the first step is still to acknowledge that the universe is cold and meaningless. He's only getting there just now. Rick, having understood this and even even done it himself, having been originally from the C-137 universe, has already processed it and moved on, instead embracing absurdism. Don't think about it, it's not that serious. Nihilism is the world is meaningless, absurdism is finding meaning anyway. In 1-6, Morty is experiencing his first nihilism, and Rick has moved through to absurdism, which leads us into 1-7, when Rick reinforces this view, which is where that first quote came from.
Nothing really mattered and there was no point to it.
Within this episode, this is meant to contrast the emotional moment Morty was having with his son to the politicized story that he went on with Summer. Look, it's not my fault humans made women political, okay? I'm just telling it like I sees it. But this still gives us valuable information about Rick's perspective in this moment. Even after seeing this beautiful moment between Morty and his son, nothing matters to Rick, because why would it? Why should Morty Jr. matter if there's an infinite number of him out there somewhere? And this begins the central problem that Rick faces. Technically it was present in 1-1, but now the audience really has it as justification. Rick can't connect with the people around him, and it's because he's not even from this dimension. It's because he sees how pointless it would be to love or care about anybody if you can just jump dimensions to a new version of them that don't feel the same way. Connecting with people is a very vulnerable experience. You let yourself open to the possibility that this new person will betray you, or leave, or even die sometimes. But to Rick, that connection is pointless in and of itself, because you can always find someone you lost in another dimension. Which is where interdimensional cable comes in. The premise itself helps reinforce the idea that there are dozens of other universes out there where crazy things happen. Things that are so unusual it puts Morty's self-burial in perspective. The commercials shown help Morty cope with the absurd and even lean into it himself, culminating in the most raw conversation between him and Summer in the entire show.
Nobody belongs anywhere. Everybody's gonna die. Come watch TV.
Morty embraces absurdism. He's not putting on a show for Summer. Matter of fact, he's being honest with her in a degree she wasn't prepared for. He's putting on the artifice of, if nothing matters, at least we can enjoy it. But we could also look at this from an anti-nihilism perspective. Not only is he saying we can still enjoy our time, he's actually connecting with Summer in a way that screams, I care about you. In a world of meaninglessness, he finds his meaning. He is, in a way, scarred by his departure from the Cronenberg universe, and we even explore these feelings later on in the series. But as of right now, 1-8, he doesn't want to leave another Summer behind. And he doesn't. He promises her, albeit in the subtext, that he is not from here, but he cares about her, and they can make it through whatever they're going through together. This is easily the best embrace of absurdism in the entire show, with Morty doing the most human thing in the universe, attaching purpose to living. It instills Morty's morals in a way that directly put him at odds with Rick for the future. Morty doesn't take the moral high ground because it's convenient. He does it because he won't let the Cronenberg universe happen again, not to the people he's decided to care about. Yes, obviously from a meta perspective, it makes a lot of sense that these two opposing forces pile up together. That's why the decision was made. But it could have just been, well, Morty is one way and Rick is another. But the show decided to give it a reason. It's truly beautiful. 1-9 plays more with the rest of the family, with Jerry and Summer taking up most of the screen time, refocusing that Rick's nihilistic attitudes can hurt the people around him, and Morty's attitude about caring for family forces him to not give up on his dad. But 1-10 brings the general nihilism about existence up to an 11. The Council of Ricks and the Citadel in general make it abundantly clear that Ricks and Mortys have a kind of intertwined destiny with each other. At least that's how Morty sees it. Morty wants to see family and his relationship with his grandpa as something inevitable, but Rick fires back saying that their relationship is essentially transactional, as Morty's brainwaves act as a cloaking device to hide him from enemies, leading to their first big fight aside from the Cronenberg fiasco. Evil Rick using a dome of Morty's to hide from not only other enemies, but from the Council itself. See, this is the beginning of the push and pull relationship between our two protagonists, where Morty keeps insisting that he's special to C-137, while Rick keeps insisting that no Morty is special because no Morty can be special, culminating in Evil Rick showing C-137 moments from his past where he does actually get emotional over the relationship with his grandson. Up until this point, nihilism was dominating, but in this moment, absurdism begins winning. And again, to make that clear, because I'll be saying it a lot, nihilism is nothing matters, absurdism is enjoying it anyway. It pushes and pulls again when C-137 is offered a free Morty voucher, and even accepts it at the last moment. But their conversation on the way out points to a few things. First off, that Morty is begging for connection due to his past experiences, telling Rick,
Connect with me a little.
it seems like we're not gonna get it, but then Rick points out that he has the Mortiest Morty, a title that must be special to him since he keeps insisting on him being the Rickest Rick. Or maybe he uses the title simply to piss off the other Ricks around him, but we do know that this Rick has somewhat of an ego problem, so I'm willing to bet it's a title he actually does care about. This conversation and the episode itself cement itself as great examples of that push and pull dynamic in the show. It's a little more specific than the dynamic of hope and despair, as I'll explain a little later, but that's a fine layman's way to look at it for now. Of course, the episode ends with the central plot kicking itself into gear, revealing that Evil Rick's Morty was actually behind it the whole time. This doesn't say much about nihilism or absurdism, but I think it's good to acknowledge that the differing universes do matter, and by ignoring them, you're ignoring what might be coming for you next. And 111 is relatively divorced divorce from this push and pull dynamic and more so focuses on Morty's reactions to Rick's already established perspective. Even if Rick is suffering and doesn't believe anything matters, Morty does. Which is why, between giving the choice of getting Rick in trouble and not, Morty wakes him up and asks him to fix this. He chooses his grandpa. An absurdist choice to say, even if nothing matters, even if nothing to Rick matters, I pick you anyway. So that was season 1, what people describe as the best Rick and Morty season. It was really important to establish this central theme of nihilism and absurdism in our characters, and how they push and pull away from those ideas. If you can believe it, season 1 was its own era, the Origins era. We established a lot of our characters, world, and plot in this one season, and it doesn't come with us into season 2. No, season 2 officially starts the cruel era. Let's talk about why. So season 2 episode 1 actually does continue right on from 111. Well, it had a 6-month time skip, but time was frozen, so it didn't really. When I think of Rick and Morty, this is actually one of the defining episodes for me. I think the split screen and different uncertain realities is a really awesome concept, and it was pulled off amazingly. But let's get back to the point. There is actually a little bit to talk about here in regards to our push and pull. Firstly, Morty acknowledges that there are infinite universes here, so like 1-8, he's finally coming to terms with being one of the infinite. Secondly, nihilism doesn't stand a chance in this episode. I think this episode handles existentialism a little bit more than nihilism, but that's a whole different can of worms that I won't be getting into. For now, let's focus in. Rick's general attitude leans towards nihilism, but in this episode, the finale concludes with Rick putting all of the split uncertainties back into order. But to do that, he sacrifices himself for Morty. This is an act that is never repeated, not to this magnitude at least, and it pushes Rick specifically, and the show generally, towards absurdism, embracing that Rick does care for Morty, even taking these crazy sacrificial lengths to preserve him. Remember that hope and despair equivocacy I mentioned? Sometimes, and a lot moving forward, the episodes just leave you with an extremely low point, a point of ultimate despair and nihilism that feels unnecessary and unwarranted. Sure, within the entire universe, there's a lot at play, and our characters don't always get a happy ending. And they don't always need a happy ending. But we are going to start tallying up some of the more egregious elements of pure nihilism, and we're going to begin to see a trend. Let's talk about 2-4. See, back this far, we still have the general trend of Rick giving some kind of shit about the people around him. 2-4 has all the imaginary parasites and introduces Mr. Poopy Butthole to the mix as a real person, ending with Beth shooting him because she thought he was imaginary. This whole episode was relatively absurdist, with the family giving genuine care about who is real and who isn't. But the episode itself didn't need to end like this. Maybe it was funny, I can find the humor in it given the context of the episode, but it feels unnecessarily cruel to me, which I guess is evened out by having the post-credit scene be the physical therapy and recovery. There are obviously micro moments of nihilism and absurdism spread throughout the entire show, like the again existential conflict of Rick's car battery forming its own miniverse in 2-6. Season 2 didn't quite have this push and pull dynamic in full effect yet, but it does definitely take a hit in 2-9, Purge Planet. I have my own critiques of this episode broadly, but I think it's gratuitous for gratuity's sake, and doesn't have that much of a broader point to the episode besides one of violence and nihilism. The end of the episode has the liberated people of the planet come together and basically set up the systems to do it all over again. I guess there's nothing wrong with a cyclical story. Some of those are really fantastic and they say a lot about society. And this technically does that. But I'm not here to talk about Purge Planet, I'm here to talk about Morty. Remember that Morty has been our beacon of absurdism, in finding meaning and connection even if everything is just one universe among billions. But here, he lets his morals slip. He freely purges, and it's okay to let the dude cut loose, even if this seems over the top to us normal people who, haven't been in a purge. Anyway, Rick has this moment at the end of the episode where he tells Morty that it's not entirely his fault because the chocolate bar he ate contained an element that made him a psychopath, then revealing that it actually didn't and Morty was just a psychopath all on his own. This helps Rick's character have a moment of actual empathy and compassion for his grandson, which we've already mentioned is rare at best. But what does this moment say broadly? The episode could have just either left this ambiguous or not had this moment at all, and allowed us to stew on the actions of Morty and let him learn from them as he moved on. Instead, it takes the hope of this episode and rips it from us, reminding us that nothing really matters anyway. First with the planet itself, then with Morty. Sure, he was a psycho here, but was it his fault? Was it not his fault? It doesn't matter, don't think about it too hard. 210 though is where some real magic happens. I gotta say, it's amazing how you can have like over 60 episodes of a TV show, but people only really talk consequentially about like 5 to 10 of them. The Smith family gets invited to Bird Person's wedding with Tammy of Earth, where we see this push and pull of nihilism and absurdism return. Firstly, Rick is in full nihilism mode during the wedding proceedings itself. His rejection of the ceremony itself speaks to the insistence that connecting with others is a waste of energy and time. It's also a personal thing for him since he thinks that Bird Person's best days are behind him. But we're talking broadly here. This nihilism angle is entirely the first half of the episode, up until Rick actually decides to let himself care about others, a push towards Morty's perspective about absurdism, which is absolutely short-lived here. After the reception goes haywire, Rick devolves back into his own perspective of never trusting anyone again, and never letting his guard down even to his own family. That is, until he overhears how his actions are hurting his family, a position he would only care about if he had moved back towards caring about others, absurdism. He realizes in this moment, if only for a second, that leaving behind a mess still hurts people, even if nothing matters. This absurdism is then reflected again in him actually telling Morty that he's leaving, instead of just doing it. If nothing matters, Morty's feelings and curiosity about what happened to him shouldn't either. But in this moment, his connection to others wins out, especially as a move in general since he is doing it for his family, which Jerry rightly pointed out is something Rick would never normally do. 2. But looking at this last picture of his friends, thinking about those he's hurt, he actually surrenders. It's actually really interesting that season 2 is sandwiched between Rick doing selfless things for those he cares about. Surely he's turned a new leaf, and this will continue. So obviously there's nihilistic elements scattered throughout, concluding with Rick making the ultimate decision about being absurdist instead. Nihilism didn't feature as heavily in season 2, even if it did poke its head in a little bit. Like in 2-3, when Unity decides to distance herself from Rick, and he decides to try and kill himself, only being saved by passing out drunk. Obviously Rick kinda deserved this treatment, but what a bummer of an ending, dudes. Let's simplify it again. Tally up a point for despair winning over hope here. Before we move into season 3, let me just say that I'm no stranger to putting people in a bad place so long as they can grow from it and learn from it. And you know what? Rick does eventually grow from this. Eventually. Let's look at our scale real quick. Attached to nihilism and absurdism is this branching path of hope and despair, and tied to that is cruelty. People who have experienced a significant amount of cruelty in their lives turn to nihilism. Not always, but there does seem to be a large correlation between the desensitization of traumatic events and this philosophy that nothing really matters. Almost as if it's a coping mechanism to move forward after seeing such horrible shit. Because if nothing matters, neither did the bad stuff, right? As such, Rick and Morty is a cruel show. Characters suffer, people die, people are brutalized even. Everyone at some point is shot down emotionally, and all of this ties into nihilism. How, you may ask? Let's look here, and forgive me for jumping around a little. 2-8. After Jerry recovers from being attacked, he tries to take control of his life just like his wife and family were telling him to do. And yes, it's a little awkward and overly controlling, but he gets shot down by everyone for no reason. Or again, Beth shooting Mr. PB in 2-4. Or really pick any moment from 2-9. What I'm getting at here is that there really isn't a reason to leave moments like this, not from a writing perspective anyway. Yes, there are in-universe explanations for these things. Jerry is a loser, so his family picks on him. Beth spent the entire episode killing parasites, and she just made a bad call. Morty got wrapped into Purge Planet because he wanted to protect a girl. But the writers didn't need to do it this way. The writers can, and we've seen it, write around these characters' biases in a way that doesn't end on a cruel note for them so often. Obviously everything in moderation, right? I'm not gonna sit here and say, this show is sad or fucked up and I don't like it. You can have sad and fucked up episodes. Having an episode that ends with cruelty, or having cruelty be ever present and highlighted, isn't inherently a bad thing. You can make it work. But we're already starting to see an uptick in the meanness and cruel attitudes of the writers for this show, not the characters. And when the reason is because that's just how the show is, it points to nihilism, not character choice. Season 3 only pushes this forward as well. Let's start with 3-1. Finally, we begin the talking point of,
he is the smartest man in the universe.
Before, Rick was a brilliant scientist for sure, but the idea that C-137 specifically was the smartest out there anywhere is unique. This is generally good internal character work, in the sense that with everything he's been through and the way he escapes in this episode, it would kind of enable him to put himself on a pedestal. It also, a la season 1, helps reinforce that nothing matters because no one is on his level. No one can go toe-to-toe with him, so what's the point? Why does it matter? Why would anything matter if you're omnipotent? It's why the bored god or the bored immortal is so common as a trope. When you have no opposition, when your purpose for living has been met, what else is there? This episode also brings up Morty's concerns I mentioned, about what if one day he's the one being buried, not doing the burying. He shows Summer his prime universe, where he specifically tries to make the point that Rick doesn't care about anything because he leaves good people behind, and he's right. This is obviously a nihilistic point, specifically pointing out that Rick doesn't actually care about anything. This is further highlighted by the fact that Morty doesn't actually try to help or save his prime family. He just wanted to pop in and pop out. He's moved more in line with nihilism to prove a point to Summer. Eventually the Citadel of Ricks emerged to save them, which, funny detail here, since Rick C-137 is from a universe that doesn't have a Morty and Summer, since Beth died, when Morty Prime tells these Citadel Ricks that he's Morty C-137, they have a look of confusion because that should be impossible. Really good detail there. So that cruelty I talked about. Obviously it's terrible that Rick's family dies in front of him, although necessary for his origin story, and not even overtly cruel. So I don't hold it against the show. I still am very confused about how Rick managed to escape by altering a memory. He didn't alter a memory, he altered his origin. Okay, but how? Anyway, Rick takes down not only the Citadel of Ricks, but the entire galactic government by setting its currency to 0. Cool. I will say that Rick leans more absurdist here by rescuing Summer and Morty at all. It would be infinitely easier to leave them behind, but he chooses to rescue them instead. But it doesn't matter anyway, as Rick reveals that it was all a ploy to get Jerry out of the family. That's right, he toppled an army of himself and a galactic government to get back at his stepson who threatened to turn him into the government. Something about that feels like it could have taken more time, and is instead done in 20 minutes. I mean, imagine if that was the plot of season 3. Now, Rick even specifically says that this is the darkest year of their adventures, so I don't need to point out that this is nihilistic, but it's actually not, it's technically absurdist. If nothing really mattered, Rick could just ignore this matter, or kill Jerry, or find a version of his family that didn't have him, but he instead went out of his way to solve this problem. So 3-1 had Morty and Rick briefly switch sides on the absurdism and nihilism scale. Offset, of course, by 3-3, our Pickle Rick episode. Nothing matters, why try, I'm a pickle. It even works within the original framework of what Rick was talking about way back in 1-6.
Stop digging for hidden layers and just be impressed. The answer is don't think about it.
It kind of perfectly wraps up in the end by pushing back towards a more neutral place of Rick trying to connect with his daughter over a drink. Although I have a slightly different read on this, I think it's instead him trying to control her affection affection, giving her droplets of attention and affirmation to keep her hooked. Breadcrumbing, as it's referred to in the study of narcissists. If my read is correct, this is still a manipulative bid for nihilism. 3-4 is more obvious with its push towards nihilism, though. There's basically no hope, no absurdist rebuttal, it's just a shitstorm of nothing matters all the way through. From Rick not even having the decency to allow Morty to engage in an adventure, to putting Noob Noob as the penultimate thing that he cares about, to Morty being so embarrassed and unimpressed by his display that he basically phones in the entire adventure, ending with a whole lot of nothing and a
who cares?
nihilistic at its core. 3-9 is the start of Space Beth, but this episode itself features other classic nothing really matters rants from Rick, so extra points to nihilism. The kicker is that Rick attempts to reject his absurdist behaviors and ideas about caring for his daughter, but he can't, ending this episode in an actually very positive place with a happy family and a happy Rick. 3-10, our finale, is about a fight with the president and ultimately wrapping up the divorced Jerry arc of the story. Jerry and Beth's relationship is the point of absurdism for the rest of the show. Even though they had their rocky beginnings and cold moments, the two of them find that even despite all the craziness that they get thrown into, the constant thing that they care about is each other. Through Beth's cloning experience, she comes to the realization that if the universe is so big that nothing really matters, she has to find something that matters and stick to it, which is what Jerry ends up being for her. This episode is also unique in that Rick also slips into absurdism for the same reason, ending the episode with Rick being the butt of the joke. He started the season as a man trying to control everything, and he only got laughed at because of it. I could talk about the random bits of cruelty that took place during the season, but I don't want to come off as pearl clutchy.
Miss Brandt?
Yes.
Get me a violin.
I'd rather focus more on the nihilism. The cruel moments that existed in the season weren't in service of deepening the nihilism, they just existed to exist. Maybe there's something to be said about that in and of itself, being that we're growing more accustomed and more comfortable with the random acts of violence and cruelty throughout the show. That used to be Morty's role, but it's now been transplanted onto us as the audience, as he manages to cope with these feelings of absurdism in his own way. Season 4 hugs this nihilism scale a bit more openly than Season 3 does, and it does it in a more cruel way. I understand deconstruction parody, but is it really parody if the punchline of every adventure is this is really stupid, this doesn't really work, and this doesn't really matter? 4-4 falls into this category, where the parody of sci-fi and dragons is basically just everything sucks. 4-6 as well, where the cruelty and violence towards some of the background characters feels a bit much, especially since the finale of this episode is basically just, hey, none of this really happened. 4-3 definitely has a nothing matter kind of end to it as well, with Rick ruining Morty's chances of getting a Netflix deal. The entire episode didn't matter except to serve the purpose of Morty getting tired and bored of cliche heist movies. There's nothing wrong with a twist at the end of an episode or story, but this felt particularly pointed in the direction of this is stupid and nothing matters about it. Not to mention actively stealing the joy from something, which kind of just sucks the air out of absurdism in general. Which seems to be the theme for Season 4 with what we talked about so far. 4-2 really sticks out as needlessly nihilistic though, and again from the perspective of the writers, not the characters. Rick makes a strange pseudo-attempt to bond with somebody who keeps sneaking into his private chambers to use his toilet, and in attempting to grow closer, encourages him to take risks, and he eventually dies, leaving Rick in this place of having done extra work for a person who never gets to experience it. Aside from this being nihilistic, this just feels cold. Why do so many Rick and Morty episodes make me feel like this?
You know why.
Rick is a piece of shit, but why are we punching up the torture porn for it? Why do we have endings like this? Endings that make me go, oh, so nothing really mattered in the end. This is more than it just being serialized. Obviously, episodes are gonna end and they're gonna go back to some kind of status quo. But this feels more like we actively spent the episode torturing or punishing our characters just so at the end we can actually go, well, none of it mattered anyway. 4-10 is the same way, with a lot of movement throughout the episode between Space Beth coming back and the new Galactic Federation attacking the planet, and the conclusion of Rick not actually knowing which Beth is the clone. There's no way to get around this plot point. If Rick was going to not know who is who, there's really no way to do that without being nihilistic. But remember how I said so many episodes have an ending like this? Why do so many episodes end on this downbeat feeling? Why am I constantly watching Rick and Morty with a feeling of holy shit, I feel awful now? The entire episode isn't like that, but ending on this note time and time and time again just feels very nihilistic, I suppose. And this ending is specifically that. Yes, Rick was avoiding it because he's just generally a shitty person, but the episode highlighting it as the last beat before we wouldn't see Rick again for another year and a half, it's really layering on the nothing matters feelings. There is a blip of absurdism though when he reveals Bird Person and his plans to rebuild him, but the final note of this episode feels very akin to the Unity episode of 2-3, when he wants to go engage and connect with his family but instead chooses to sit alone because nothing really matters anyway. So you can see that the scale of nihilism and absurdism kind of got tipped one way this season, and I think this is the part I remember the most about Rick and Morty, this middle part where it seemed like everything was unnecessarily violent, cruel, or nihilistic. I think it's around this point in the show's run that viewers just started to tune out. They felt like they got all the stories they could have out of Rick and Morty, and why is that? It's because the nihilism within the show was so prevalent, so in your fucking face, such an unavoidable part of the viewing experience that it became repetitive. This era of Rick and Morty, besides the cruel era, could also be dubbed the repetitive era. Rick and Morty do a thing, someone unnecessarily dies or is horribly maimed for no reason, nothing mattered in the end, everything is shit, no one changes, the end. Except on repeat, with very few exceptions over the course of 4 seasons. This term, repetitive nihilism, was the real death nail for Rick and Morty for a really long time. It really started throughout season 2, but season 4 really punches it up to another level, and season 5 is not much better. Right off the bat, 5-1 has a very nihilistic attitude to start us off with. Generally speaking, having a world that moves, changes, and evolves without you being present kinda calls into question why even engage with it at all. But the episode ends with Jessica having spent eons in that dimension, with her conclusion, of course, being literally nothing matters because I've seen everything. Because why wouldn't it be for this show?
Fuck off, I'm a time god!
5-2 is nihilistic in idea alone. Who knows what or who is even real, and does it even matter? I mean shit, this is even echoed in one of the interactions, when one of the space squids realizes that he's actually a decoy and just kills himself. Absurdist reaction for sure, but the narrative itself is pointing towards nihilism. It's amazing how often this line of "this isn't real" gets pulled in the show. You'd think they'd get fucking tired of it. Especially the very end where it turns out, hey, none of these families were actually the real Smith family. Why even have this episode? Why even do it like this?
You kinda had to be there. For what? No story has been told!
5-3 has yet another one of those gut punch endings, albeit this time from the absurdist side. Morty does the right thing by breaking up with Planetina, and he's punished for it. It again just ends the episode on a negative note. On a note of like, hey, fuck you for caring. It's sweet that his mother comforts him, but it literally ends with a side-by-side of Morty's rotten face and Morty crying. Like, Jesus, the A-plot of this episode may not be nothing matters, but fuck man, I feel like I was punished for that. Oh, and yeah, the B-plot is that anyway. The B-plot was Summer and Rick going from Apocalypse Planet to Apocalypse Planet to party it up. At least this time it's actually shaken up, where nothing mattering is actually positive. It would have been pretty easy to have people be upset or sad or depressed or nihilistic about the end of their world, but instead everybody celebrates that nothing will come from tomorrow. At the very least, it's absurdist in the first suicidal kind of way. 5-8 is one of the more plot-focused episodes, where Memory Rick is introduced as Rick travels through his friend's head to try to put him back together. Sweet story until the ending when Rick gets no appreciation for what he's done, just because he was going to keep the memory of Bird Person's child from him.
In bird culture, this is considered a dick move.
But narratively, it just points to Rick once again foregoing connections, which ultimately will lead him to more nihilism. It is unfortunate that Rick was actually giving a good effort to be a good friend here, and he even mentions in the beginning of the episode that just going to a different dimension to get Bird Person isn't something that friends do. Despite him being overtaken by his general dickishness, it's kind of 2 steps forward, 1 step back for Rick in this episode, which I kind of appreciate. I definitely appreciate it more than just being fully nihilistic and negative. It's got plenty of negativity though, like Rick meta-commentating about Bird Person's psyche, but it just feels like more annoyance and frustration rather than actual appreciation for the art. I get it, some people aren't art people, but damn dude, it kind of feels like biting the hand that feeds you. Why should we the audience be impressed or care if the characters don't even care? Luckily this episode has a post-credit scene of Rick talking to his memory self, which feels fine. At least it's not a random gut punch at me for actually caring about these characters. 5-9 also doesn't end on a bad note. Obviously the idea that Morty matters so little that 2 crows could replace him is rude as fuck, but it's actually more absurdist than nihilistic. At least in the way Rick is describing it. He acknowledges that his relationship with Morty is toxic and probably shouldn't continue, which places value onto Morty in general, rather than just hand-waving and saying toxic or not, nothing matters. Empathy in and of itself is an absurdist trait, since you have to care about the things around you at least a little bit if you're going to be empathetic towards them. Now let's talk about 5-10 and Evil Morty. Evil Morty tries to live authentically in his do what you want, I don't care, I'm just doing what I do kind of way. You have to understand, aside from the lack of empathy and compassion in general, this is actually absurdism taken to its extreme. An utter disregard for anyone else because you just gotta do what you gotta do and living as selfishly and authentically as you possibly can be. Evil Morty is never rude about his decisions. They always just come off as, this is what's happening. It's never nihilistic in the sense that nothing matters, because things do matter, destroying the Citadel and the Central Finite Curve, even loosely pushing Morty Prime into giving up on Rick. These are all aims that could be hand-waved if he was nihilistic. Selfishness is very closely tied to nihilism, but if you look at the philosophies themselves, it more closely aligns with absurdism, which makes this finale, in a way, the ultimate push towards absurdism. Matter of fact, the push is so strong from our antagonist that even Rick relies on it a little bit during the end, for the requires 2 partners to push sequence. Obviously he needed a second body, but he chose Morty specifically in a pinch. This ending sequence gives absurdism a fighting chance for the Rick and Morty universe, especially as a way to balance out the generally nihilistic season that we just experienced. Not to mention, just keep in mind, this was done by the writers. The characters are still plenty nihilistic, but the writers decided to put their foot down and say, hey, let's have an ending that doesn't feel like shit. This episode also handles Rick's backstory, and it handles it in 2 central ways: rushed and angry. Rick cannot fucking wait to be done with that part of the story, and it is kind of an element that has been touched upon before in the past, and certainly will be touched upon in the future. But the point here is that Rick, and by extension the story itself, do not want to tell you about his origins. They are are desperate to avoid putting any actual stakes or canon events on our characters, and that fucking sucks. What sucks more is they end up taking it out on the viewer specifically.
You wanna jump the shark? Now everyone can shut up about it.
Bro, fuck you! You're mad because people are interested in you? Why are you taking this casual spitefulness towards us for giving a shit? Now, before season 6, let's talk about the unnecessary cruelty and brutality. It seems like it was toned down a little bit in this season as well. I mean, it definitely has its moments, not to mention yet another extermination of a planet in 5-5, but the very last post-credit scene has Mr. PB talking about not having as much time as we think. My first initial read was that this is cruel, and it is a little bit. Seems like we're really torture porning my man here. But I know that this speech was meant to be a somewhat inspiring take control of your life final message for the show. And with Evil Morty's actions, it seems thematically relevant for it. Slight gut punch, but a gut punch with a positive message goes a long way for me. 5-4 is a neat case for me though, because it doesn't have any particularly nihilistic ending, or even angle to it either. Not that this has never happened, but I think we can finally point out why. Morty. Morty has been the primary focus of 5-3 and 5-4, which allows his absurdist ideals to slip into the episode in a more primary way, dulling the nihilistic parts. The reason this isn't enough on its own is because Rick is an overpowering force to Morty by design. So you have two halves of an ideology, nihilism and absurdism, but one was always written to be intentionally weaker than the other, which kind of proves my overarching point, that the show was written to be nihilistic in general. Most of the episodes that feature a more positive, upbeat, things do matter message to them are ones that heavily feature Morty over Rick. Even in the episodes that have the two go side by side, it's at best a coin toss, and at worst a foregone conclusion that the episode will have a message akin to, you should have never even tried, or what, you thought you were special? So far, I've had a lot of criticism to give about the nature of this show. It feels negative, brutal, cruel, and nihilistic for basically no reason, making the characters, and by extension the audience, feel stupid for even trying. Now let me take a little break here and play devil's advocate. Star Trek The Next Generation is a show where one of the central themes is hope for the future. Sure, it has episodes that end more cruel than others, or episodes that have a more negative note, but overall, that's the story it's trying to tell. So with that in mind, maybe Rick and Morty is just that for nihilism. Star Trek is where you go for hope, Rick and Morty is where you go for meaninglessness. If that's the case, sure, I guess, go wild. But I don't necessarily think that is the case. Otherwise, the episodes would have far less positive moments. Star Trek would have 10 hopeful episodes for every one negative one, but Rick and Morty seems to have them more evenly split, maybe even closer to 7-3 to account for the casual cruelty, desensitized violence, and negativity. So, right, Rick and Morty just is the nihilistic show, and I should stop complaining about it. But, 6-1. Season 6 finally concludes the cruel era of Rick and Morty, an era that was largely defined by repetitive, over-the-top cruelty and nihilism, making it an experience you knew you would walk away from with a negative taste in your mouth. Season 6 finally starts us off on our latest era of Rick and Morty, which I'm simply calling the new era. I didn't want to be overly dramatic and call it the redemption era or anything like that, but I think Season 6 onwards does do away with the repetitive nihilism, and it does do enough new things to justify the title. 6-1 opens with Space Beth saving Rick and Morty, then Rick needing to reset portal travel since Evil Morty broke it on his way out, except he accidentally resets portal travel lures and everybody gets pulled back to their home dimensions. To quickly recap, since the show keeps it a little vague if you only tune in once every 18 months like the release schedule encourages, Rick gets sent back to the C-137 universe, where there's a dead Diane and a dead Beth, which means there is no Morty, Summer, or Jerry. Jerry gets sent back to dimension 5126, where he was accidentally taken from in Jerry Baree, the daycare for Jerrys. But he became a part of the family, so he became their Jerry. Morty gets sent back to the Prime Dimension, or the Cronenberg universe. Summer, Beth, and Space Beth are the family members that are natural inhabitants of this universe, the C-131 universe. Oh, and just to jump ahead for a second, as far as I can tell, the Parmesian dimension is just called the Parmesian dimension. It doesn't get a designation like C-985 or something like that. So anyway, the episode itself. This one is interesting because normally when the multiverse is talked about, it's within the context of this is happening a billion times, so it doesn't really matter. Why grow attached? Why care about the people next to you if they're so easily replaceable? Rick even promised Jerry this in 5-5.
I'll replace you next time.
And yet he rescues him from C-5126. He rescues all of his family, in fact. The C-137 dimension is a hellscape, one stab after the next about how Rick has let his grief, depression, and younger angst destroy the people around him. Meanwhile, Morty has to come face to face with the dimension he left behind, and the consequences of that on his family. Jerry became quote-unquote perfect without a family, while Morty stayed the same. Although that's what the show wants to say, but Morty actually has turned into a badass traveling with Rick all these years. I mean shit, look at the spear throw. While Morty's absurdism gets a bitch slap of hey you left us behind, a harsh look at the people that Morty doesn't put into his absurdist influence, Rick's nihilism gets the same thing. The entire dimension ruined, his house a testament to his dead wife, returning with his mission incomplete. This is the consequence of nihilism, of nothing mattering, and it actually lets Rick, having spent some time with people who do care about the universe intrinsically, see that this cruelty and nothing matters approach is unhealthy, and he does let it go, deciding to release everyone from the cycle they've been trapped in, and rescuing his family. That is, until his car reminds him that the same dimension Morty was returned to is the one that Rick Prime was returned to as well. And in an instant, all of his healthy progress is swept away as he's returned to what's governed his life for so many years.
My moms are in trouble! Those versions of them are!
Suddenly nothing matters because there's always a replacement. replacement. This is actually tremendously hypocritical, something that generally Rick isn't. Those versions of Beth don't matter, but this version of Rick does. You can't have it both ways, buddy. Either everybody is replaceable or none of them are. The hypocrisy is exactly what allows this to be one of those coin flip episodes that actually goes in Morty's favor. Morty is able to talk Rick out of his nihilism, not just by appealing to his general sensibilities, but by specifically appealing to absurdism.
You're my grandpa, Rick!
This episode begins a more character-focused trend between Rick and Morty about Rick exploring absurdism as a way to counteract his nihilistic attitudes. Right up until the end of this episode even, when Rick, well, really season 2 Jerry, destroys the entire C-131 universe, and Rick has to take the family to the Parmesian universe. The thing is, Rick tries to insist that he didn't have to save them, and he doesn't actually care about them, and they're all replaceable. But this time, nobody buys it. No one actually hears that this is a real threat, because his actions spoke louder than words. Morty asks Rick if he's still bait for Rick Prime, and Rick responds that he's not. Firstly, if he's not, then why save him? Point to absurdism for Rick. But secondly, Rick treats this like a bad thing, almost like he would have used Morty for bait, but he doesn't think it'll work because Rick Prime doesn't actually care about anything. Rick says this in almost a dismayed tone, as if he wishes he could be more like that, which I think is a sign of discomfort at opening himself up to absurdism. If you remember, that was his mission for 210. But now, here we are, 30 episodes later, where Rick is trying once again. My original thesis of Rick and Morty is better now actually starts here. While it's still a mixed bag, I think season 6 specifically starts a new kind of thematic relevance for Rick and Morty, even trying to deflate the nihilism side of our scale. We've finally moved past the repetitive and often depressing cruel era of seasons 2 to 5. This season seemed to focus more on the science fiction storytelling aspects. Very season 1 of it.
I'm so sick of that fucking note. What the fuck does it even mean?
6-2 was Summer doing a Die Hard, 6-3 was Clones falling in love, and 6-4 was The Night Family, all relatively devoid of nihilism. 6-5 is not only not nihilistic, but it's actually really absurdist and optimistic, where it could have been really easy to end on a cruel note. When Jerry ruins Rick's immortality by completing his fortune and claiming he was his friend, Rick blows up on him, which is very in character, but then he apologizes, as it was rather harsh to beat up on somebody who didn't understand the cosmic consequences, like punching a puppy for trying to snuggle you. It reads a little harsh, but ends really positively, an attitude and perspective that Rick never would have engaged with before now. 6-6 had some nihilistic undertones about the futility of human nature, but even if that's the case, I don't think it's overwhelming to the point of obnoxiousness. I actually think this episode really nicely encapsulates the difference between character nihilism and narrative nihilism. In Rick's conversation with the dinos, he tells them that selfishness and selflessness are two sides of the same coin, so it doesn't matter which one you pick. Take a shot for every time Rick says it doesn't matter. But how is the tone of him doing this? This isn't the entire episode being about that. It's not the narrative being beaten over your head. It's one character in one moment expressing his views for the sake of the plot, all within universe and all within reason. This moment ends with the dinosaurs going back on their anti-pacifism stance, proving Rick correct. But this isn't the end of the episode. Before the dinosaurs leave, they give a tit for tat and close the rift that Rick left in the sky. They're obviously doing just fine, not held down by depression or nihilism at this revelation. Then after the dinos leave, Rick manages to fix portal travel like he said he would, leaving this episode off in a really positive place, even taking Morty to Boob World. This is how Rick and Morty should have been doing nihilism all along, but better late than never. Putting aside all the praise I've given so far, this season hasn't taken us fully out of the woods yet. Season 6 episode 7 shows an overt disdain for the viewer in a way not seen before. This episode is about following previous Leon into the meta layer and parodying the meta layers of storytelling. It's unusual to have an episode like this for a few reasons. Because number one, breaking the fourth wall and intentionally pointing things out to the audience is not really something that shows do. Even in Rick and Morty, it only really happens once or twice a season. And number two, this episode has the creator of the show, well, specifically Rick, but we're all aware he's a stand-in for Justin Roiland, right? Like how Brian Griffin is a stand-in for all the beliefs and values of Seth MacFarlane. So we have Rick lambasting the viewers unabashedly and blames them for wanting to actually see more of the characters they've grown to love. There have been numerous examples of authors biting the hand that feeds them for basically as long as the concept of media has existed. But this level of disdain and spite that Rick seems to have for anybody who actually wants to examine this show and take it a little bit seriously is just unprecedented in the show so far. Except maybe a little in 5-8, as I mentioned. They're going to shame you and beat you if you actually want to engage with the show in any of these ways. Ultimately, they're saying don't think about it, it doesn't matter. The objective narrative truth is that without the elements they're pissed off about, stories couldn't exist. Story structure is a real, observable thing because without them, stories would not feel complete. I mean, maybe in a French cinema experimentalist type of way, you could have a story that has no narrative elements whatsoever.
I went to college!
But Rick and Morty has never really tried that, and typical American audiences are not primed to engage with media in that way. Also, that's not what's happening here. This isn't Justin Roiland getting experimental with it. It's just the show throwing a tantrum, and you, me, and the audience are blamed for caring about it. It really sucks that this episode has to take this tone, because I actually think that it's one of the more creative episodes of the show. If it wasn't so inherently nihilistic and spiteful to us as viewers, I actually would adore this episode about exploring tropes and media elements that make a story. But instead, it gets resigned to the continually growing pile of needlessly nihilistic adventures. Luckily, that level of anger directed towards the viewers is kept kept within this episode, although you did see it a little bit in 510 when Rick casually snipes at Morty for wanting to know more about his backstory. 6-8 is an overall fine story, but unfortunately suffers from a cruel ending. Overall, I think the episode really does a lot for Rick and his desire to move forward, points to absurdism there. But the very end of this episode feels unnecessarily mean to Rick, the only person who actually doesn't deserve it. Now, maybe that's the point. It's extremely uncommon, I can count it on one hand actually, to have an episode where Rick is actually blameless. He doesn't actually do anything wrong in 6-8. I mean, sure, maybe he pushes boundaries with Dr. Wong's patients, and maybe he's a little crass with Jerry when he's in the middle of something, but he does listen to Dr. Wong's advice. He does work to restore Pissmaster's legacy, and furthermore, he does not do it for himself, or even Pissmaster, but an innocent third party in the form of his daughter. He even intentionally hides Pissmaster's suicide from his family so that he can spare Jerry of all people from some heartache. And what does he get in return? Morty of all fucking people decides to ruin it for him. This just slams Rick down for being the only person in the episode to actually be a good person. And this points towards nihilism once again. It's reinforcing that nothing matters and everything sucks. Why work to improve yourself when your family is just going to give you shit for it? Why do anything for Pissmaster if the family cohesion Rick was trying to preserve is going to get fucked up anyway? Sure, maybe this is just desserts since he basically has been trying to push Morty into this mindset for a while, and he succeeded just at a bad time. But narratively, because again, you have to think, who wrote these characters? Human beings had to sit down and decide, yeah, we're gonna have an episode where Rick gets slapped down by Morty for doing everything correct. So this episode narratively does away with the push and pull that made seasons 1 and 2 so amazing, instead defaulting to the same repetitive fuck you for caring attitude that the show has been going strong with for 3 fucking seasons at this point. 6-9 is interesting because it begins a 2-part story about Rick replacing himself with a robot. Overall, the episode isn't necessarily nihilistic, it even has callbacks to earlier adventures, actually rewarding people who do care to remember the previous stories. Even if this Rick is just a robot, it shows an interesting and fun shift towards a dynamic where Rick and Morty actually do get along, and Rick isn't just an ultimate piece of shit. Anyway, Rick replaces himself with a robot because Morty tells him that he's boring.
Oh, like you're not at this point.
I think there's 2 ways to read this. Number 1 is that Morty is actually acknowledging that the nihilism is getting fucking old. The repetitive nature of the show is taking its toll, and people, Morty at least, are getting fucking tired of it. Number 2 is a more depressing one. Morty is bored of Rick's journey to become less nihilistic. Remember that this is on the heels of 6-8, the episode where Rick did nothing wrong. Morty, our beacon of absurdism, is bored with having no opposing force, no nihilistic presence to fight against. Although I don't buy into this read 100%, because in 6-10, Morty is rather pissed at Rick for going robot mode and abandoning his family. One way or the other, it's actually kind of interesting and nice to see a more healthy Rick, a Rick that is actually trying to make Morty's life better. See, the good and great parts of Rick and Morty's dynamic was that even if Rick let Morty suffer a bit here and there, he did care about him, and he did want to make sure that he was alright in the end. Best evidenced by an episode I didn't really talk largely about, 3-6, the episode where Rick and Morty remove their toxic traits. So 6-9 ends in a really optimistic way, actually. No slights from Rick, no statements or observations, just a heartfelt I love you from both of our protagonists. 6-10 gives us some more insight on Rick's mindset when he replaced himself, believing that letting Morty into his life was a negative thing because it only gives them the opportunity to hurt you. I wouldn't call this nihilistic as much as I'd call it unhealthy and negative, but those are character prescriptions, not narrative ones. 6-10 in general is very plot focused, so there isn't a whole lot to say about it honestly. I could say that Rick's spiral feels like it's slipping into hopelessness, and that can be construed as nihilism if you want to go that far, but I don't need to grasp at straws to find examples of the show being overly nihilistic, so I'll leave that choice for y'all. The cruelty in season 6 has been notably toned down, with 6-8 being that huge exception. This finale even felt kind of absurdist, with Rick letting Morty into his hunt for his nemesis. There's also the philosophical quandary of robot sentience, if only in the sense that robot Rick is Rick in a way.
Anything I do is technically something Rick did.
Rick is kind of haphazard about this, but he genuinely turned into a better person this season, and believe it or not, season 7 actually continues this. Let's address the elephant in the room regarding season 7. Justin Roiland was not a part of the show whatsoever this season, or any season following. He was texting minors, and I'm really glad that the industry is still holding some kind of standard when it comes to removing even prominent people from projects. Better than our US government, am I right, fellas? Ayo! Now, Justin Roiland has been an absentee creator of the show for quite a few years at this point. My research seems to indicate that he was very, very hands-on with the writing for seasons 1 to 3, but seems to be primarily a voice actor in the later seasons. If season 6 laid the seeds for the show to eventually improve upon itself, season 7 was the harvest. So before we get there, I just think it's important to talk about what the work culture was up until that point. Justin Roiland had a drinking problem, and it seemed like he was very, very into the concept of nihilism. That's not inference, here's some behind-the-scene clips.
Fucking God, it's crippling our mortality. We're fucked. We're all gonna die, don't you understand?
It would be foolish to assume that Justin's deference to nihilism in his personal life didn't influence the writing of Rick and Morty in any way, especially since, like I said, he was much more hands-on with the writing in the beginning. Once the tone was set, the writers just had to head the course. It was only much later in the show when Justin decided to be fully hands-off, and the writers thought that maybe they could try some new stuff, actually improve the characters, build arcs, and allow stories to conclude. Even then, we know for a fact that Justin Roiland did not make it easy on them. We have reports that after COVID, Justin insisted on recording his voice lines at his house. For a creative medium, this is particularly damaging because it means that there isn't really any input from the creative directors. Now, this isn't just the shit on Justin hour, even though the dude deserves it. Not my fault, okay? I don't make the rules, don't sex kids, and I won't talk shit. We gotta separate the art from the artist here a little bit. Rick and Morty is the single most successful Adult Swim show to ever air, and the middle half of it was repetitive as fuck. Now, boring and successful are not mutually exclusive. Take Star Wars The Last Jedi, for instance. But I think there is something to be said about the audience kind of getting over it. The show wasn't really offering anything new to its viewers, and even at time was actively slapping them down. Until, finally, season fucking 7, baby. Let me say broadly that this nihilistic angle of the season has been more so relegated to its characters, not the narrative. The episodes aren't nihilistic, some moments and characters are, which I think reads much fucking better than anything in the past. 7-1 unfortunately continues the trend of not having much plot relevance, but it is actually an absurdist story for Rick and Mr. PB. The nihilism in this episode is entirely in the background, the general angst and sadness of Mr. PB's fall, but it's completely offset by the absurdism of Rick's friendship, starting the season off in a place of relative caring about the people in Rick's life. 7-2 follows the same trend, with Rick actually developing a friendship with Jerry of all fucking people. And this episode actually has a huge core difference that I mentioned. The only nihilism and cruelty we see from this episode is from Rick himself, not the narrative. The narrative is neutral about Rick's attitude towards his son-in-law, and even amplifies that neutrality by having Jerry just be equally as mad about it. Usually when episodes play out this way, they have a gut punch in the end, but this episode actually has something different. It ends with optimism, some notion that, hey, even if they yell at each other, they were once great friends and they could be again someday. Maybe I'm narrativizing a little, but think of it this way. That sentence I just said, they could have only done the first half. They could have made it a, wow, isn't it fucking sad these two used to be friends and now they hate each other. But it doesn't do that. 7-3 is yet another example of a visible change in not only Rick's demeanor, but the narrative as a whole. When Unity takes over Virginia and the president and Dr. Wong try to get it back, it's not just one notable moment from Rick. There's the moment when he's processing and freaking out about Unity's return, and he accidentally blows up at Summer, then apologizes under his breath. There's a moment when Rick departs from the president without murdering him for being interested in his therapist, actually handling boundaries and his temper in a responsible way. There's the moment when Unity leaves for the last time, after not only trying to open up to her, but being rejected for opening up to her. And lastly, there's the end. Do you know how easy it would have been, and how likely it probably would have been in season 4, to have this episode end with Rick listening to the voicemails, reflecting on how all of this is his fault and he could have been more attentive with the people who cared about him? But instead, he listens to the voicemail and leaves the house. He goes to commiserate with the president, typically someone who's on thin ice with him at the best of times, and connects with another individual instead of just drinking by himself alone. This is a huge step for him on a character level, but let's also remember that this is not the first time he's decided to not drink alone. 6-8 had him trying to drink with the other biggest piece of shit in the galaxy, Pissmaster, except the narrative couldn't allow it. This time though, the narrative does. It doesn't stop Rick at the gate, it doesn't kick him in the balls for trying, it just ends on a nice interpersonal moment. It rolls the credits with a good taste in our mouth, which, like Jesus, when's the last time that happened in Rick and Morty? Before we get into 7-4, let's go back to our nihilism versus absurdism scale. Before, the show was using this scale as a way to kind of balance ideas, to allow Rick to bring the show down and Morty to bring it back up. This worked for a little while, but as the show went on, as Rick became a more dominant force and the writers fell more into their nihilistic ideas based on Justin Roiland's attitudes towards writing, the scales got tipped in a way that felt not only repetitive, but bad. Maybe not bad in a technical sense, but it made me feel bad. Watching Rick and Morty was like sitting down knowing full well that I would end the viewing experience feeling depressed, deflated, or just sad for the characters it tortures for no reason. But season 7 seems to have left this nihilism skill as a relic to the earlier seasons. It's no longer about narrative nihilism, it's about character nihilism. Specifically, combating Rick's instinctual inclination to write off or push away his loved ones that care about him. This may seem like a small distinction, but I promise you, the episodes just fucking feel better now. I wanted to say that before we talked about 7-4 because this episode specifically deals with an inherently depressing topic. So depressing, in fact, that Summer actually drops the word nihilistic for what I think is the first time in the series run. Ironically, Summer is actually using the word incorrectly, however. Rick is known for his nihilism, apparently in-universe as much as out-of-universe, but the fact that someone kills themselves and turns into spaghetti isn't nihilistic on its own. The nihilism would come from it not mattering that they killed themselves, but since it did matter to Morty, and actually didn't matter to the rest of the family, they would be the nihilistic ones, not Rick. This is the most technical actually ever. Am I known for that? Morty's involvement in the spaghetti planet basically causes the government to encourage people to kill themselves so they can sell the spaghetti to foreign players. The episode then goes through a little bit of a philosophical tangent about what it takes to constitute a people. Honestly, the philosophical conversation about this topic and the general conversation regarding mental health surrounding suicide, and the absolutely dystopian, over-the-top ways the society encourages their culture to kill themselves all compound into like maybe one of my top 5 episodes of Rick and Morty of all time. It even nails the ending. They could have solved this crisis in any number of ways, but letting Rick make spaghetti distasteful is really beautiful in a subtle way. I'd also like to mention that this episode isn't exactly lighthearted. This is a subject that most people have had a brush with at some point in their lives. And not only did this episode make it funny and comical in a fucked fucked up and subversive way, but it did it in a way that didn't feel negatively polarizing. Speculation territory quick, I almost wonder if the old Rick and Morty attitude would have given less of a shit because Rick would have some really negative things to say about people who commit suicide. But instead, this was completely skirted, and the narrative itself kept the topic of suicide fucking neutral somehow. Just bravo, man. This episode becomes the baseline for the kind of Rick and Morty adventures and stories that the new seasons want to tell. We finally move past the annoying, overly depressing, nihilistic hill that Rick and Morty was poised to fucking die on. Let's also talk briefly about the characters that have taken center stage so far. Mr. PB, Jerry, the President and Dr. Wong, and then Morty. All with the inclusion of Rick, obviously. Morty was also more involved in 7-2 as the B story, but the point I'm trying to make here is that Rick and Morty themselves are occupying less of the story now. This points at my presumption about season 6 onwards being correct. As Rick grows into less of a nihilistic prick, and Morty takes shape into somebody who kinda has input from both sides of that scale, the show can finally tell episodes that aren't one-sided anymore. I can't definitively point at Justin Roiland's departure as the reason for this change, but I have my suspicions. Regardless of the reason, characters like Jerry, Dr. Wong, Mr. PB actually have the chance and opportunity to be developed into more than just one-off characters. Which brings us to absolutely the best episode of Rick and Morty to date, Season 7, Episode 5, Unmort Rickton. Can I talk about this for a minute? Can I just complain for a second? I despise to my very core the title of every fucking episode of Rick and Morty. Rick Fending Your Mort, a Rick Convenient Mort, Rick Mirai Jack, Jurassic Mort. Jesus Christ, pronouncing these are just so over the fucking top. Okay, so 7-5. Remember how it seems like since season 6, the show has actually been wanting to follow up on elements of the show people actually wanted to see? As long as I can remember, people have genuinely been very interested in what drove Rick to being the way he is. People have been very curious about what evil Morty has been up to. So much so that the show even parodied people's interest in the Story Train episode. Well, 7-5 gives answers to the people who have been caring and hoping the entire time. We start with Rick and Morty returning from an adventure, only it's evil Rick and evil Morty, and we see how Morty built his eye patch and began controlling Rick. It then details a bit more of his journey, going to rent a Morty and wiping his profile from the database, then kidnapping the other Mortys across the multiverse for his dome he had in season 1. Then we recap all the events that led up to his departure in 5-10, leaving off with his last note of stepping into his yellow portal and fucking off out of the central finite curve. We then jump ahead to see him relaxing within said universe until there's a disruption in the multiverse because Rick C-137 is fracking the timelines to try to track down Rick Prime. Evil Morty interferes to help him finish faster, or more specifically to get him to stop faster, and they track down Rick Prime, who turns into a venom goo and traps them in the sub-basement. It's there that we learn that Rick Prime used the Omega device to wipe Diane from every reality across the multiverse, not just one. There is no getting her back. Our protagonists deal with the other antagonistic Ricks and escape with a little piece of that black goo intact. The first solid lead on Rick Prime Rick has ever gotten. He fucks off to fight him, and Evil Morty goes on his own as well because he wants the Omega device to himself, and he invites Morty to come along with him. Once everyone has arrived, Rick Prime begins boasting, and he wipes out Rick's family from the multiverse one by one, starting with Uncle Slow.
This one hurts me too.
There's a really awesome and intense battle sequence that takes place, which ends with Evil Morty doing a fake-out switch with him and Morty, then incapacitating Rick Prime. He then takes the plans for the Omega device with him, rejects Rick Prime's offer to join forces, and pulls Rick 137 in there and patches him up to let him brutally murder the fuck out of Rick Prime. Rick Prime taunts him the entire time, but it's no use, and eventually Rick emerges with a not alive amount of blood on him. He seems dazed though, and Evil Morty clocks it perfectly. Rick goes home with Morty where the same song plays that did upon Morty's first day in the replacement dimension, after he buried himself. Except in that episode it ended with Morty not being able to move forward quite yet, and this one ends with Rick taking the first steps towards normalcy. Now when I spell out the entire episode like this, it sounds like fanfiction. But listen, the reason for that is because you have been denied. You have been rejected and denied receiving stories about Rick and Morty that actually drive the plot forward and actually care about giving you answers and satisfaction. These things can exist. In fact, a lot of fucking TV shows actually do. Even goddamn Family Guy follows us better than Rick and Morty does. So obviously this episode is my favorite in the entire show. And just like a Marvel movie, there's actually a million tiny details within this episode that I feel like I need to talk about. Obviously it's really on the nose, but
Rick and Morty, 100 years.
Is exactly what our Rick and Morty reference with each other, which means that this element isn't actually unique to our Rick. It's an unassailable element of their dynamic. Once they get to the Citadel, the Rick behind the counter says,
You know how we feel about pirates.
which is a reference to 310 when the president looks up Rick's weaknesses on Wikipedia.
Oh, run, Morty! That part was true!
In the Morty directory, we can't read the language used in his dimension, but he's the only Morty picture who isn't smiling, unless you count the directory itself, which has a worried-looking Morty on it. The Ricks that Evil Morty kills across the multiverse are the same ones we see in 110. The show gives added context to Evil Rick's last words of,
Kill me! Do it!
as he was actively trying to commit suicide during his time with Evil Morty. When the Venom goo consumes our three heroes, the goo also consumes their portals, which is the first time we've ever seen anything physically interact with Rick's portals. When the Ricks enter the gauntlet of killing each other, our Morty pitches the idea that Rick should kill Evil Morty, which is random and unprompted, showing that he's got more of a killer instinct in him than we tacitly assume. When our heroes have to kill the last Rick, Rick and Evil Morty attack in sync in a way we haven't seen in the show before. The level of coordination they have together without even talking about it is truly incredible. When the Diane robot comes out to wipe out the survivors, she yells that he sucked at eating pussy, and Rick takes an extremely humble approach about it. And it's likely that this is both a mix of his continued therapy journey, but also him having a genuine soft spot for Diane. Morty says that Rick never mentioned that he killed Diane across infinity, and that's because it was never actually revealed until this moment. So yeah, he didn't, and that's something we're all taking the journey on together, little buddy.
Looks like we survived the box.
You should count chickens professionally, Morty.
I didn't trigger that.
This interaction displays a fundamental change in how Rick and Morty talk to each other. For one, Morty actually stands up for himself. For two, Morty is actually correct. For three, Rick's insult isn't inherent to Morty. He didn't insult him for being him. He insulted him for his action. And the action he took wasn't actually his. But overall, the biggest difference is his tone. This isn't Rick going off and insulting and yelling at Morty for 2 minutes about what a piece of shit he is. It's him making an actually witty remark about their present situation. I felt like this was important to bring up since I've been talking about the difference between the later seasons and the cruelty of the earlier seasons a lot, and this is kind of the cornerstone of it. Not that I was expecting him to freak out, but Evil Morty never even looks concerned when the fire gets close. I mean shit, even Rick is panicking a little. Also, the way that they work together intelligently, again without even talking about it, is like they're on the same brainwave. It's really impressive. When they do figure out the solution, their portal is a mix of green, black, and gold from Rick's portal, Morty's portal, and the black Venom goo. Rick leaves and tells Morty that he can't come, but tells Evil Morty to stay out of his way. He knows that A, he can't control Evil Morty, but B, he would come anyway, just don't be a problem. But him telling Morty not to come is indicative of actual caring. It's not the same vibe as don't fuck it up. Evil Morty predicts that if Rick kills Rick Prime, he might kill himself next, which is a concern quickly dismissed by Morty, but when push comes to shove in season 7 episode 6, Morty is actually a little concerned about it. Evil Morty says,
Come or don't, I don't care.
But then when the portal closes on him, Evil Morty does actually come back for him, and this is because he actually needs Morty for that fake out during the fight. Rick Prime taunts Rick about killing his wife. He also says that they were the only two Ricks who actually invented portal travel, and everyone else just hitched a ride after. With what we saw of Rick's backstory in 3-1, this totally makes sense, as it seems like Ricks were just given the technology by other Ricks at some point. But our Rick was the only one who rejected it and had to make it himself. And hey, it's really interesting and ties back to another previous episode for people who were paying attention. Evil Morty then tries to shoot Rick Prime, just as Rick C-137 tried to shoot him. Amazing parallel and good instinct. Uncle Slow is the first family member to get wiped from existence, and he's also another callback from 111. The Rick Prime duplicates that attack Rick aren't fully developed decoys, so similar to the decoy episodes of 5-2, they have visible signs of being not fully disguised. The details, dude, they are on point here. Slow Mobius uses his powers right before he dies, which makes the death happen slower, and in previous episodes and seasons, I would expect this to mean that he's ripped apart atom by atom, slower than he needs to be, or maybe a layer of skin and muscle gets removed excruciatingly slow and painful, but instead, he just blips out of existence. That feels better for a device like this, but I think previous seasons would have handled it differently, and I'm really glad that this amazing fight isn't tamped down by random unnecessary violence and cruelty. Now, the fight itself has a lot of really amazing highlights. First off, Rick and Evil Morty once again fight together like they've been in combat since birth. Their coordination is stunning. As I understand Total Recall, the Quados are only telepathic with their hosts, so Evil Morty being unable to read his mind is actually canon. Evil Morty handles himself just fine, but a Rick Prime decoy does get blown up by our Morty, controlling a decoy's arm rocket launcher, which is a really awesome detail about how our Morty, even if he isn't a killing machine like Evil Morty, is more than capable in a fight. I mean, he even had that episode in 5-9 where he solved his own problem with the Portal Brothers. More and more, we see how Morty slips into the role of being a competent fighter, and this is a really, really great nod to that. And it's actually at this moment in particular that I can talk about the music. Oh my gods, the music! Even in episodes before this, the music composition was really fantastic. But this episode in particular highlights it in a way I never thought was possible. Combining elements of classic 80s synth and contemporary beats to create a music that never seems to overpower, but does create a feel that is completely unique to Rick and Morty. We saw it in full force during the intro backstory when Evil Morty wiped himself from the database. And now we see it again during this fight sequence, with Morty's rocket launcher shot being an awesome music stick. The music is done by Ryan Elder. He is spectacular, and all the tracks that were done for Rick and Morty are available online if you look hard enough. If you like the 80s synth aesthetic, I would highly advise giving them a listen. Evil Morty takes out all the other robots, knocking everyone to the ground but Morty and Rick Prime, as he pulls himself back together. Rick Prime acknowledges that he is his original Rick, which is the first time that's happened since 6-1. It's then revealed that it's a fake out, but if you know Morty's mannerisms like we do, he actually wasn't fooling anyone acting like this. Only Rick Prime doesn't know his mannerisms, so it fools him. Really awesome. Evil Morty then thanks Morty for the assist, confirming my theory about actually needing him for the fight. He even brought an extra eye patch for him. I mean, sure, maybe he always carries an extra, but it seems more deliberate to me. When Rick Prime and Evil Morty begin talking to each other, the dynamics are kind of flipped. Although Rick is always the more talkative one, Morty has never really been quiet necessarily. But here, it's basically Rick Prime pleading for him to let him go, even though it's through the guise of complimenting Evil Morty for doing everything he's already doing. Despite the predicament, Rick Prime never really senses the danger he's in. It's actually really amazing that Rick Prime continues to goad Evil Morty, but he never takes the bait even once. His composure and tolerance for dealing with Ricks is incredible. The important bits are that Rick Prime's backups get fried by Evil Morty, and then Evil Morty takes the plans for the Omega device from him, specifically called Booger AIDS _V2, because that's what Rick names for everything as revealed in 6-1. After getting what he wants, he drags Rick into the room, revives him, and tells him to knock himself out. Rick then begins beating the fuck out of him, with Rick Prime being unable to talk his way out of this, which is probably an unusual situation for an important Rick to be in. Usually he's always got some kind of leverage, some kind of backdoor or extra plan, but this time he was just outplayed by Rick and more importantly Evil Morty. What Rick Prime says is actually really interesting though. Rick Prime asks what Rick's life would be without him, and Rick, not joking or dismissing, says,
Let's find out.
This is easily the most serious we've ever seen Rick. But the longer conversation is that Rick Prime says he made him, and
With that power,
he raised echoes of his life. Fellas, he's actually correct. As far as a revenge scheme goes, Rick C-137 basically lived Rick Prime's life, raising his grandson. If Rick Prime actually cared about his family, this would have been good revenge, but he doesn't, so it's not. It's just circumstantial. Although I wonder if it did get under Rick's skin a little, since he admitted he did only use Morty originally to flush out Rick Prime. Rick Prime then states that C-137 would have done what he just did it first. It's hard to tell if this is true, but given what we saw in 3-1, I don't think so. But then we get the line delivery that sticks with me for the entire show.
you lived in my house!
This is the last words we get to hear from Rick Prime, and it's chilling to me. Firstly, the delivery is given through puffed lips and broken teeth, but it's given laughingly, smiling. He sees the cosmic irony and hypocrisy of the situation, and it makes him laugh. Now, the content of the words. He basically is saying that Rick C-137 was Rick Prime in every way that mattered. He raised his grandson, hung with his family, killed probably just as many if not more Ricks than Rick Prime did. He was him. He lived in his house, in his world. It's meant as one last humiliation for him. Kind of the note of,
Look what has become of you.
for Rick to think about when this is all over. And obviously, the punch to death scene is brutal, but number one, it's not even as gratuitous as it could have been. We've seen more violent things in this show than just that. But number two, it feels like that's necessary. I know given my priors this is gonna sound like a weird sentence, but extreme and overt violence has a place in the narrative. There are reasons to have characters beat the ever-living shit out of each other. There are plot implications for why Rick C-137 didn't just shoot Rick Prime. Evil Morty then destroys the Omega device, making his stolen schematics the last trace of them. Rick then emerges and we see Evil Morty smile for what I think might be the first time in his entire existence. He knows that if Rick killed him, the Omega device would be firmly in his hands, and only his hands. And then we get the final kicker.
How's it feel? Exactly the same? Yeah, it always does.
Lads, do you know what this is? It's nihilism. It brought it back to relevancy in a way that the plot actually justified. This feeling is one explored throughout media a lot, the after of revenge. The Princess Bride is my favorite simple example.
I have been in the revenge business so long, I don't know what to do with the rest of my life.
Rick C-137 is feeling the same thing in this moment. He thought that killing Rick Prime would avenge Diane, and maybe it did, but it wouldn't make him feel better after her loss. There's not a big red button that is hit once it's over that says now you can feel better. Anybody who has grieved knows that's not the case. And now that his quest for revenge is over, the grief, which has been relatively unprocessed, is the only thing he can focus on now. But there's also the sleeper fact that Evil Morty is the one saying it. His whole bit was accomplishing something spectacular, something only he could do. The destruction of the central finite curve, and fucking off to dimensions beyond. The fact that he is the one acknowledging that accomplishing your goals doesn't make you feel any better means that his earlier line of,
just another day in paradise,
is ironic, or at the very least riddled with denial. He knows this feeling, which means he doesn't actually feel at peace with his choices. Evil Morty then threatens to use the Omega device to end the Rick experiment, and Morty asks why he doesn't just use it then.
using a weapon like this doesn't get you left alone.
Another fucking callback, dudes! In 410, Rick directly tells this to Spacebeth.
The trick is to be left alone by by whoever succeeds.
Evil Morty is more Rick than some Ricks we've seen. Now, obviously, that's what they were going for, but this is the best example I can see in it. He's echoing the words of a man he's never heard before. And now, the conclusion. Evil Morty was right. Rick doesn't actually feel better after killing Rick Prime. In fact, he feels like everybody is so far away from him. Well, that's what the song says anyway. The song is called Look On Down from the Bridge, and it's not composed by Ryan Elder, but it is still great.
Not quite my tempo.
This scene is supposed to echo Morty's journey after arriving in the replacement dimension in 1/6, and it does a really great job of establishing the same vibe, except for one key difference. Even though it is just a moment, Rick does actually get nudged by Morty, and he laughs at Jerry with the family. He goes back to immediately having the same faraway look, but it shows that he's surrounded by people who love him and want the best for him. This is something that Morty didn't have in 1/6, as Rick was just ready to accept it and move on. Then the episode ends, but after the credit sequence is Uncle Slow's wife looking for anybody who still remembers her husband, doing the same exact sequence of when Rick tried to do the same for Rick Prime in 510. But he or she manages to find somebody during her quest who is doing the same exact thing. And instead of letting her grief consume her, the two move on together, remembering their loved ones in a healthy way and integrating their families together at the same time. And that concludes the best episode of Rick and Morty that has been released yet. In this episode, in the stuff I counted, and there is probably more, the episode called back to 10 past episodes 15 times. In one episode! Normally we get 3 callbacks in an entire season. And folks, that was only the technical breakdown. I didn't even talk about the themes yet. Obviously, this episode has a pretty heavy and important moment of nihilism baked into the narrative, but the episode itself isn't particularly cruel or even negative and depressing. It kinda plays like a classic Rick and Morty adventure, except with more stakes, more backstory, and more plot. The absurdist angle between Rick and Morty is there in more smaller and subtle ways, but it wasn't the focus of the episode. I think this is the best moment of nihilism in the entire show. It's about a personal conflict and what it does to your psyche to have it resolved. Leaving an experience feeling nothing at all is a very real and scary thing to grapple with. And I think that's why this episode and this moment feels so important for the health of Rick and Morty. We're not just doing nihilism for the sake of nihilism anymore. The show doesn't just say, well, it's a nihilistic show, deal with it. It has a reason now. What really hits right at home for this episode is that every plot-focused episode of Rick and Morty before now has felt like an unfortunate obligation. Something that the show had to do, not that it wanted to do. But this is 7/5. This is smack dab in the middle of the show. You could have thought, it's a middle of the season episode, and missed it because you picked up an extra shift at work. The show didn't care if you saw it or not, it just made the best fucking episode of Rick and Morty to date and buried it right in the middle. This episode really was the best of the show, and I think part of the reason I made this video is because I feel like a lot of the people who opted out during the dreaded repetitive era of seasons 2 to 5 missed it, and that's a damn shame. Despite my glazing, I think it is important to acknowledge that this episode isn't perfect. In fact, it kind of begets a trend that unfortunately affects a lot of the plot-focused episodes. Pacing. Pacing is a tricky concept, and I wouldn't say this episode was rushed, but it feels like they definitely could have slow-rolled it a little. Now, it took us 7 fucking seasons to have Rick come face-to-face with Rick Prime, so I don't know how much slower they could have made it go, but the details that are revealed and the speed at which they move through it feels very quick. Them fracking the finite curve and getting the space venom feels like it could have been one episode, maybe even focusing more on the other Ricks that were hunting Rick Prime and maybe playing into how they're all kind of similar. Then you could have had a full episode where Rick and Evil Morty confront his nemesis and take him down, maybe needing to take down the Omega device as its own plot point rather than something that happens quickly. A 2-parter doesn't sound too crazy to me. The reason I think it's important is because there are a lot of major beats that happen in this 122-minute episode. You have Evil Morty's origins, then the reveal of the Omega device, along with the specific reveal that Diane was wiped from all dimensions. It's very dense, specifically because the reveal that Diane doesn't exist anywhere is kind of a really big one for the show, and I feel like the audience wasn't given the proper breathing room to realize how big of a decision it actually is. Still absolutely number 1 in my book. Let's see if anything else comes close. The rest of season 7 is a little bit slower paced, but that's not hard to do after 7/5. 7/6 is actually a direct continuation of 7/5 though. It acts as our interdimensional cable episode where Rick ends up being depressed after killing his nemesis, just like Evil Morty predicted. This leads Morty to cash in his Morty punch cards, entitling him to an adventure to kickstart Rick back into gear. This premise is inherently absurdist, with Morty caring about his grandpa, and it even has a happy ending, with Rick acknowledging that Morty was trying to do something nice, and the two jumping on an adventure. The episode even calls back to a season 1 adventure, so it just felt very holistic. 7/7 is about the Quado journey, which is very divorced from the nihilistic perspective. Although it could be seen as absurdist that Rick goes on this hunt to try to save Summer and Morty, 7/8 is the episode with Water T and the Numericons, which I don't really care for personally. This episode isn't nihilistic though, and that's all we care about right now. Although it does fit within that framework I mentioned before about how the season is allowing alternative characters to have the spotlight, with Morty's math teacher and Water T making a return. 7/9 is another classic Rick and Morty adventure. Rick tries to explore Valhalla as an energy source using Bigfoot to kill himself and get there as an afterlife. The Pope captures Bigfoot and uses him to kill his enemies, and Rick and Morty eventually stop the Pope, ending with them destroying the energy relay to give up on infinite power. The episode has somewhat of a nihilistic perspective, like the idea of an afterlife being an endless spawn point makes dying kind of redundant. But if that is really the nihilistic message they're trying to share, Rick straight up overcomes that by destroying the relay. There's even genuine empathy and understanding, not to mention an apology from Rick towards Bigfoot. And it still has comedic moments. It's not dry as fuck just because it's not depressing anymore. This is a solid A- episode, even if it's not plot related in any way. No, I won't be ranking every other episode. I gave it an A- for no reason. Deal with it. I will say that this episode plays out a little bit more seriously than the other Rick and Morty adventures, and I think that's also due to Justin Roiland's departure. I don't exactly know why, but he seemed insistent on voicing every damn side character that existed in the show. I know it's amusing when Seth MacFarlane does it, but Justin Roiland did really take it to another level. But with him gone, there's no incentive to really do comedy or story like this anymore. They allowed a completely unrelated character, Bigfoot and the Pope, to occupy the B story and flesh out the narrative of this episode. It's very fascinating. 710 is neat for a few reasons, but for starters, it's a season finale that isn't really plot focused. Every season finale before now has had some shift in the family dynamic, or some huge move by Rick in regards to his own position in the family. But this episode in particular only has one great moment at the end for that, and aside from that, it's another classic Rick and Morty adventure. My favorite kind, actually, as this one deals with the philosophy of internal fears. First, we start with our heroes not being scared at a haunted house, which kind of proves that point I made earlier about Rick and Morty being desensitized at violence and horror. But after they arrive at Denny's and Rick and Morty jump into the hole, the episode takes us on a fun ride of we conquered our fears over and over and over again, as they don't really realize what their fears are, so knowing when the ride is over is part of the mystery. The overall beat-for-beat summary is actually less important than the specifics here. Rick, in an attempt to connect with Diane, mentions that anything except for him and Morty aren't real, an inherently nihilistic take. The thing is, number one, he's right, because this isn't just another dimension. They are specifically in an experience that will mimic the world around them. He's not being nihilistic here, even if the words are the same. Number two, he doesn't beat it over everybody's heads while drunkenly rambling. He just says it and the show moves on. Number three, the show moves on. This is a point of view from the character, but the show doesn't harp on this concept and make it the entire episode. Moving on, we actually do get a little bit of lore about how Diane and Rick met, which means that this episode does have a little bit of plot thrown in there. The closest we get to legit nihilism comes from Morty a bit as he confronts the G-Man in the Denny's. He starts asking questions about the whole, and he talks about how Rick is afraid of being happy, afraid of love, etc, etc. Morty dismisses all of this as dumb and superficial, but again, this is Morty's decision, not the show's. The show isn't beating us to death with it. I just really can't stress that distinction enough. Then they do the bit where they can't tell if they're still in the hole time and time again as they conquer different deepening aspects of their psyche. We also have a specific fourth wall break from Rick, which has been very sparse from the show since Justin Roiland left. The ending of the episode, confronting Morty's true fear, is really cool though. Rick plays it close to the vest on his feelings towards Morty, but in the end, it's what Morty needed to hear to acknowledge he was living in reality. Morty then lets slip that Diane was in the hole, leading Rick to run his ass back to the hole in a huff, just as Morty did initially. Except, instead of jumping in, he pulls a picture of Morty out of his wallet and puts it on the wall. First off, he had a picture of Morty in his wallet. Cute! Second off, he ran back to put it on the wall. He's proud of him. This is the most sweet ending I've seen from a Rick and Morty episode since fucking 1-8. And it's also the end of the season. I don't even have to do a quick recap on the unnecessary cruelty because it seems like any cruelty that was within the story had a justified and later redeemed reason. This season was great, easily the best of the entire show, counting season 1. And it gave us easily the best episode of the entire show. So, does season 8 continue it? Does season 8 continue moving away from nihilism for the sake of nihilism? 8-1 is interesting in that it isn't a classic Rick and Morty adventure, and doesn't play on too many plot points either. It's just a consequence of Rick punishing Morty in Summer, and how the world ends up dealing with that. I think the story overall it tells is really amazing actually. How Morty made the most of his time in the Matrix prison, and how difficult it is to get a job and commit to a normal life after committing a crime. Not to mention the war that goes on about it, how Morty was an instrumental key in that, and how Summer orchestrated it. I wish Morty would be a little bit more pissed at her when he finds out this reveal, but it's really amazing as a narrative. Rick says wubba lubba dub dub in this episode again, and that's the first time he's done it in a while. Canonically, he shouldn't be, because it means that he's in immense suffering, and when he says it, he's happy. But also, like Morty says, he says it ironically, so maybe it does make sense? Shrug. This episode ends with a return to the status quo. Not unexpected, and nothing to say about nihilism or absurdism besides what is inherent to the Matrix as a concept. It's also rather funny, and features a good angle to the family in one way or the other. The most notable thing about this episode is that it seems to go out of its way to not be cruel. Morty runs over a random dude with his tank, and he is alive in his car. Rick goes out of his way to spray some random scientist with anti-radiation gel to save his life. Morty doesn't actually kill anybody with his tank when he attacks the power station. These are all things that totally seem like they would just kill or maim random people because haha funny blood and guts. But the show seems to go out of its way to not. Even the people that are inside the Matrix that Morty kills or dies with aren't overly bloody or gory. Sure, people get stabbed and blown up, but the way that they're illustrated and depicted wasn't like it is before. Which again, not to be pearl clutchy or anything, but I appreciate. The shock value of random brutality in this show was old like 4 seasons ago, and I'm really glad to see them move away from it a little. 8-2 introduces Rick's ongoing relationship with Space Beth, while also bringing Bug Ann into the mix for Rick as a companion. It's another non-classic Rick and Morty adventure, but seeing Rick do things with his daughter, things that he does have a lot of experience and proficiency doing is something that kind of felt overdue. There isn't anything nihilistic in this episode either. There's even familial caring, which could be classified as absurdism if we want. And it comes from Rick about Space Beth when he tests the formula on himself before giving it to her. And there's even a return of Bird Person and his daughter, where everybody involved seems to be not only happy with this part of the adventure, but glad that they get to do it with family. It's one of the rare episodes that Morty doesn't actually feature in at all, but the surrounding context of the episode is interesting enough to carry both an A plot and a B plot, which is a great note in my book. 8-3 is a plot-adjacent episode, so we won't be seeing much nihilism in it by default. But the episode actually does have a good bit to say about caring for people that you're in proximity with overall's Rick sacrificing himself at the end to save the Mortys. The plot bits about these being the Ricks and Mortys that don't have a different dimension to return to, who were made and cloned to be in the Citadel, actually puts to rest some of my concerns about the Ricks who worked there. The problem I always had with a system of infinite interdimensional versions of the same special dude is that they would be the same special dude in every universe. But the inclusion of hardworking Ricks kind of disproves that, except now we know that a lot of them were cloned, not found in the multiverse. I don't know, it makes me feel better at least. The narrative of this episode is basically overall's Rick doing a John Wick, despite the name of the episode being The Rick, the Mort, and the Ugly. Again, to mention the cruelty aspect, this episode has brutal things happen in a way that doesn't feel overly done or gratuitous, which is perfect to me. The only really nihilistic note is one at the end, essentially just clarifying that even though John Wick just happened, it doesn't really affect our protagonists. The whole story didn't really matter. But that's honestly a passive element of any Citadel episode, so I can't be too mad about it. 8-4 is more of the same, so I feel like I don't really have to go over every detail. I like the final conclusion of the Smiths family fucking up every holiday, not just Easter. It doesn't feel nihilistic if only because they're all doing it together as a family. Also, all holidays are bullshit, so they're kind of right. 8-5 is a classic Rick and Morty adventure with some fun twists and turns. Season 8 brings us classic Rick and Morty adventures without the inherent nihilism. If you remember way back when, I talked about how Rick and Morty were diametrically opposed. Rick vouched for nihilism and Morty vouched for absurdism, and this was the foundation of the show. But now, the show isn't quite based around those two competing philosophical beliefs. Now, it's just straight up Rick is a dick sometimes, Morty is often the moral compass, let's have adventures. 8-5 is exactly that. This is becoming the norm, and because it's not so tied up in depressing philosophies, it can be easier to swallow. I mean, come on, nihilism and absurdism aren't exactly what I think of when I'm wanting a chill time. One person being a dick and the other being a voice of reason is a much easier show to get behind. And it doesn't tie them down quite in the same way. While there are tons of ways to tell a story based around nihilism, there are even more ways to tell a story that isn't just tethered to that ideal. The story of Rick and Morty taking the place of the cryostasis rich people isn't one that has to be nihilistic, depressing, or sad. It can just be goofy. 8-6 is the closest we get to the days of old in regards to violence, but even if it's violent, it's not quite gory in the same way. Directly contrast this scene of the theme park guy getting ripped apart to the heist guy getting pulled apart in 4-3. Or actually, you could contrast the same exact thing when you see Summer pull the skull out of the big head. Even still, the story is actually thematic in a sense. Rick used to like gritty, horrible, realistic depictions of Earth, but now seeing it after going to therapy, having revelations and moves with his family and Morty, he's outgrown it. I'm gonna say something, and I might be reaching. Rick's rejection of the original Earth world is symbolic for how the show is moving past the over-the-top storytelling of seasons 2 to 5.
Am I, like, supposed to think it's cool that there's measles in the water and, like, snakes? Nah, you guys have fun.
We've done this already. We've told this story. We get it. Disease, death, destruction. We can finally move on. We can finally walk out. The symbolism is culminated when the two child Beths turn Rick into an old man, and he tells them he's proud of them. Rick walking away from his destructive tendencies, his previous interest in the grotesque and violent, allows him to finally connect with his daughters in a way that he never would have been able to before season 8. Well, season 7, but still. Well, season 6, but still. Other than this thematic note, following suit with the rest of the season, nihilism isn't really anywhere to be found, which means there isn't really any absurdism to combat it, besides the general care for your family type of message that the show has been allergic to up until now. Now, it wasn't a deathly allergy, we got it in small doses, but it's important to acknowledge the change. 8-7 is funny because it's kind of the meta episode of season 8. They talk about comic relief characters, story arcs, how a story has to be cyclical. It's basically a lot of the same shit that they were talking about in season 6, episode 7, but done without the inherent hatred for people who are interested in it. The vibe and tone of this episode is almost trying to make up for biting our hands in season 6. It's another classic Rick and Morty adventure, again without the nihilism. Seems like our trend for season 8 is still working for us. There's even a bit of rudeness turned praise for Jerry in this episode from Rick, which I wish is how it worked the whole time. Mostly it's just been everybody shitting on Jerry because he was an easy target. But Jerry here actually does something. He actually saves the story for our protagonists. It ends on a comedic note with James Gunn being given a sundae and dying, which I suppose is a little negative. It also ends with a comedically unfortunate situation for Jerry, but the thing about both of these endings is that they don't feel over the top or overtly negative. The Jerry one is intentionally done for a comedic punch, and James Gunn was a one-off character. And while it does fit into the category of negative for him to get shot while trying to give the world hope, it was done in service of trying to critique some mobster element of Warner Bros. I cannot comment about the mobster element, I haven't worked there. Maybe James Gunn knows something something that we don't? 8-8 is actually a Jerry episode, like a full, actual narrative episode, y'all. He starts in a place, goes on an adventure, and ends in a place having actual consequences and decisions made. Rick and Morty appear, but they're more side characters for this one. Nihilism does not feature, and if we tone it down and just go for cruelty, it's not there either. Now that's almost to be expected from an episode that barely features Rick at all, but one of the only parts that does feature him is actually him encouraging Jerry, telling him that traveling dimensions might be good for him. No cruelty, no judgment, just genuine encouragement. We have never fucking seen that happen before, y'all. Season 8 unironically breaking new ground for the show. 8-9 brings the return of Morty Jr., Morty's son from Season 1. Although I do have to say, the picture of Snowball from 1-2 is in the background of this conversation. Snowball inconsistently appears in that photo, and it's just interesting to see an acknowledgement of him so far away from when it happened. This episode was released July 20th, 2025, and the Snowball episode was December 9th, 2013. That's 4,221 days ago, guys. Insane. There's also another silly reference to Downbeat, the game that the family plays sometimes but never finishes, and Morty doesn't even know the rules to. It comes on the hospital TV, and before we get to the rules, the TV mutes. It's very amusing. If anyone actually knows how to play Downbeat, let me know in the comments. Anyway, take a guess. Anything nihilistic about this episode? We have Trash World, where everything sentient that Rick threw away has formed its own society. Not nihilistic. We have Summer and Rick trying a new mind-reading restaurant, where they try to escape via Summer's dinner. Not nihilistic. We have Morty and Morty Jr. learning to care about each other despite a tumultuous relationship. Absurdist, if you want to go that far. But yet again, more realistically, just falling within the purview of familial affection. What about the last note? That's the real coin flip. Morty Jr. writes yet another book about Morty being a bad dad, and he gets a book deal from it, where the family finds it and is unhappy. Except Morty, he seems fine. They're at the airport, so Rick pulls them away quick. Doesn't seem nihilistic to me, or even negative for that matter. So yet another episode in the can that just felt goofy, fun, and enjoyable from a sci-fi adventure standpoint. Not a classic Rick and Morty adventure, but it didn't feel bad either. So now, how about the final episode of Season 8? This episode falls into the plot category, following up on Memory Rick, who was introduced when Rick went into Bird Person's brain in 5-8, and snuck into Jerry's brain in 7-2. It opens up to this fact in a funny way, with Jerry saying that Rick has always been there for this family, which we obviously know isn't true. So Rick scans his brain and finds that Memory Rick has been living it up inside Jerry's head, altering his memories. Rick resets him and brings Memory Rick into a Windows 7-esque prison for safekeeping. Philosophically, this episode is establishing that memories are sentient beings, which I think is a really rad take. Every memory is the existence of a different you, and a different whoever was in that memory, perpetually existing forever for as long as that memory exists. It's very Coco, or more specifically, it's very Dia de Muertos with how that celebration goes. Obviously, the science fiction element comes from Memory Rick jumping from brain to brain. With a sentient memory running around and doing damage, it's really gotta fuck with your head, and we later see that with Beth. It's actually a very interesting topic in regards to memories having an active impact on how your reality is shaped. Not only your perceptions, like with Jerry, but eventually your action. Memory Rick invades Beth's mind and is giving her new memories in the past. He alters her future, like the training she receives and her skills as a pickpocket and combat specialist. Is this realistic? But I don't fucking know. We've never seen a sentient memory before. Fucking maybe. Speaking of sentient memories, Rick takes the memory of Diane out of his head so that he can be more open with Bug Ann. He does this by transferring his only memory of her, one where she's at the gun range, to a spare, externally grown brain in a jar. Now, I have questions. Rick Prime removed Diane from all realities, but I guess he couldn't do that with memories? Hit up Dr. Doofenshmirtz, he's got an innator for that. So anyone who knew the people affected by the Omega device still remember the person, but the person themselves are removed from reality. Which is what it seems like until the end of the episode when Rick talks to Beth about their adventure and she reveals that she knows Mom raised her, but she can't remember her. And in her memories, whenever Diane is present, she's just a glitch. Rick then says that he only had a scrap of her.
This was a very confusing interaction!
I'm officially confused on how the Omega device works in regards to affecting memories. Maybe we'll get more info on that in Season 9. So anyway, Beth wanders into the garage and checks on Memory Rick, where he invades her mind and works his way back to the memory of when younger Rick left Beth behind for work stuff. Quick insert before I talk about this. Beth is Beth C-131, just so we're all clear. So it's here that we can see Rick C-131 is dressed up as Rick Prime, which I guess they all did at some point. Well, everyone except Rick C-137. This is the first time we've ever actually seen Rick leave his family, as I guess they all did. Rick C-137, our Rick, is the only one who differs from that path. If we go back to 3-1 real quick, we can see that when Rick Prime offers C-137 portal technology, it's the same model gun that he uses here in 8-10, which means that Rick C-131 actually accepted the offer, and this is the next step of that. Bit by bit, we're getting a cohesive timeline of all the relevant Ricks. Anyway, Memory Rick drops through the ceiling and re-enters her life, at least as a memory, beginning the brainwashing of his daughter to save Diane's memory, which I suppose to him is just Diane. Rick attends an event that Bug Ann invited him to, where he was more successfully open, and he seemed even happy to be there. We see more of the brainwashing and specific techniques that Memory Rick teaches his daughter, and Beth bears these fruits by making it to the sub-basement and uniting the memory of Rick with the memory of Diane. So Diane and Memory Rick talk about how she's a memory. Diane wanders off and accidentally gives sentience to a Beth memory, leading to a cascading memory memory failure. Space Beth comes in to check on the sub-basement, and Beth tries to knock herself out, leading to a pretty cool fight scene actually, with Beth pulling out things that she learned from Memory Rick in the past. Again with that altering the present by altering memories kind of stuff. She remembers training with her dad, so she is trained. Beth is hopelessly brainwashed, like Winter Soldier level shit, where she tries to tell Space Beth what her memory dad told her, politely, calmly. Family! Oh shit, now we're in for it. Beth just snapped her damn neck. She's got Memory Rick and Memory Diane in her head, and she's on the run. Also, do you hear that music again? Shit, man, this is gonna be good. Rick fucks off from the event, pissed that it went poorly for him despite taking Diane out of his head, and stumbles upon Space Beth, resetting her broken neck. I'm not mad about it. It makes sense in this universe since her skull is already metal, but I do kind of wish this episode had everlasting consequences. Imagine if 810 was the episode that Space Beth fucking bit the bullet because a memory of Rick was trying to save a memory of Diane within her clone's head. If that isn't a loaded sentence, I don't know what is. Beth's breakdown about staying a family is some of the best voice acting I've ever heard, and it's all due to her voice actor Sarah Chalk. Truly great job. She was also Elliot in Scrubs, if you ever saw that show. I didn't really get to do a cast breakdown for this video, but I loved Scrubs, so I had to mention it here. Memory Rick getting closer to Beth's recent memories is represented by a recap of some of the more recent episodes, which I think is a really dope way to do it. They start in 8-1, then 8-4, then 8-6. They mention that Beth is doing a bad job of hunting them down, but that's because she's going around her own head and waking up memories of herself. I imagine practically this is basically just erasing memories from her own head, since if she used to have a memory of doing something in school that was overwritten by a memory of her dad teaching her to crack a safe, that was then overwritten by a memory just fucking off, that memory would just be barren? Like it would have no substance? A folder with nothing in it? A lot of interesting ways to think about this episode, which I think is why it's pretty high up on the Rick and Morty list for me. Memory Rick then finds himself in the beginning of this very episode, before the awoken memory Beths come to get him. And guys, again, the music, it's so beautiful. And the dialogue that the memory Beths have with Memory Rick, the feeling of true betrayal, the continual repeating, "This is how we stay a family!" While she drives off a cliff and the music swells, the memory realizing that they're helpless to do anything about it, man, it is so good. Super dramatic and narrativized for a Rick and Morty finale, and super unique in the sense that we've never had a fully Beth-centered finale before. Then there's Space Beth trying to save her clone despite already being killed by her once, and then Beth's rogue memories dragging out Memory Rick and making him face up to the consequences of what he did. Something she was never able to do without this exact setting. Every element of this just comes out to play, and it is so fucking cool. Maybe I truly am just a simp for great voice acting, but Sarah Chalk's inflection when she yells at him in this moment makes it feel so cinematic. This dramatic climax ends with Rick showing up and making nice with his daughter, telling her that he wasn't there for her and he's sorry, which is only something he could have done now, given all of his therapy removing Diane and the interpersonal development that he had to go with through Morty over the last few seasons. And we have the cherry on top of it all. Earlier this episode, when Beth saw how supportive Memory Rick was in Jerry's head, she says, "How did we get this version of you?" And now, holding him at knife point and watching him talk his daughter down, "Why didn't we get that version of Dad?" It's just a really amazing callback to the beginning of this journey and how we even started this. Rick uses this tender moment to incapacitate Beth, which I don't think was the only intention of lovingly talking her down, but look, it had to be done, okay? Rick then sucks the memories out of her head and resets her like he did Jerry at the beginning of the episode, specifically telling her that the memory isn't real and her mom loved her more than to fuck with her head. They all return to the family, and Rick proclaims that Memory Rick is gone, leading to everybody getting somber about it. Rick rightfully points out that he was gaslighting Beth, but people are just generally sad to see a nice version of Rick blip from existence. What's neat is that Rick decides to leave, opting instead to go hang out with Bugan. The reason this is of relevance is because this is the first and only time in the entire show when Rick has another option to his family. If he wants to feel included, welcomed, and accepted, he doesn't have to disappear into a bottle anymore. He has others in his life who can tolerate him and want to be near him. It's then revealed that Rick actually drove out to the middle of nowhere to shoot Memory Rick and Memory Diane, who are both still very much alive, into space, allowing them to have peace together. He then says he's going to mind blow himself after this, but the thing is, he doesn't. Instead, he looks at his phone to see a text from Bugan, doing exactly what I prescribed, looking to others for acceptance. The text was sent and seen a while ago, but not answered, which is kind of a bummer, but broadly, I'm proud of Rick for trying. The fact that he reached out at all, despite how minimal, is such a massive step for him, and one that would have never been done in the past. It ends with a sigh from Rick, but no alcohol, no disappearing into a bottle, just a still remembrance of what he did as the rocket of memories flies away. It's a little bit of a somber ending, I'll admit, but as far as somber endings go, I think it's actually really beautiful for the other parties involved. Also, you know, even if it is a sad ending, let me be consistent with the position I had earlier. Obviously everything in moderation, right? You can have sad and fucked up episodes. Shows are allowed to have a sad ending sometimes, you know? This season hasn't really had a negative or cruel ending before now, so if it had to be 1 out of 10, even if it was the last episode, that is just fine. You also have to consider how fucking nihilistic, brutal, or cruel this ending could have been. Rick could have screamed at everyone in his life. He could have gone off the deep end just because people were interested in seeing if he was okay. His family could have blamed him for Memory Rick in the first place. But none of that happened, instead focusing on the emotional journey of Rick. And not just the journey generally, but the journey specifically around Diane. For the longest time, literally forever for Rick, he's been trying to avenge this wrong, to make it right for his dead wife. But between 7-5 and now this, Season 9 is going to feel completely different. And because this video took way longer than expected, I can confirm that Season 9 feels like it is actually trying new stuff with Rick and Morty again. I am going to spoil 9-1 real quick because I am just so damn happy with it, so if you haven't seen it yet and don't want to get spoiled, just skip to the conclusion. So firstly, goddamn, I did not expect Evil Morty to be in the first damn episode. Talk about giving season premieres plot relevance again, huh? It seems like we won't be seeing much of him throughout this season though because of the ending. Rick and Morty don't usually explore elements of romance, but this episode decided to explore the adjacent feelings of it between Rick and Morty. I know that kinda sounds weird, but the whole idea between Morty being jealous and insecure because Evil Morty is just him speaks to something inside of every one of us who have been in relationships before. And those of us who haven't, pretend I guess. So already the show is exploring an element that has gotten touched on in the past, but not fully explored as an idea. I actually wouldn't say that there's a single damn repetitive idea in this new episode, which like, holy fuck, that was the whole video. Season 9 is actually doing new things again, and it's only the first fucking episode. Speaking of doing new things, this episode is also basically a combat piece, making the show a big fight scene between all of our characters. This shit felt like an action movie, and that is awesome. Not that Rick and Morty hasn't done that before, but not quite to this extent. And something about it feels different this way. Maybe it's because the show actually remembered that it was a comedy cartoon, so a lot of the combat punchlines and engagement is actually funny again. Despite that, there still feels like enough classic Rick and Morty moments to make the episode not feel like an entirely different show. Like when Rick takes them to the bunker dimension and just rants and crashes out about how this is their life now. Or when he literally wrestles with Morty and the phone stands perfectly vertical. There's callbacks everywhere, like when Evil Morty shows the hostage dimension family and you can see moments of the family from previous episodes. Rick gives Morty another gun.
This one might be for keepsies, Morty.
Referring to when he gave Morty a bunch of guns in 7-6. And finally, the time freezing device that he used in 1-11, which gets the damn attention of the time police. Like, damn dudes, the whole finale of this episode is just a callback to something earlier. That is a big deal. Similar to seasons 7 and 8, there isn't a whole lot to say about nihilism for this episode specifically. But we could really quick talk about cruelty and violence. There wasn't a whole lot. It was basically a non-stop fight sequence, and yet there's shockingly little blood, guts, gore, any of that would have really gone over the top in earlier seasons. I even had an instinctual moment where I was worried because when the collective started getting sucked into itself, you could see that going really violently and really over the top for shock value. Like its skin folding into itself, or something gross and grotesque along those lines. But it just didn't. I think, and I'm a little nervous to say, but I hope we are finally past the shock value portion of Rick and Morty. There's also this interesting moment.
His name is Frumble Wurmple.
No, it's not.
It's not. It calls itself the Collective.
Before Justin Roiland left, it seemed like they really didn't give a shit what things were called. You know exactly what I'm talking about. It's like, try to make up a fake word right now, and that was the name of the antagonist for an episode. And I wonder if this isn't a direct acknowledgement of like, hey, yeah, we're done with that. It was stupid and needless, and we're moving on now. I hope so, because I fucking hated calling everything a schmorp or a glorp or a whatever the fuck. There's also some other miscellaneous things that make my heart flutter. Like the music, again. The classic 80s composition this time isn't just uniquely synth. It's actually an 80s synth remaster of the opening theme. Like seriously, do you hear this shit? It's, oh my god, it kind of feels like the show has pride in itself again. It says, hey, here's Evil Morty, here's the Omega device again, here's the Time Police, here's an 80s remaster of the title theme. That's right, bitches, we are back. I do have to say though, it seems like it's now a consistent theme that the Omega device is just gonna get pushed along really fast. It was a huge game changer for 7.5, and it was contained within that episode. And we do the same thing here again. My critiques for 7.5 come back to this one, but look, I'm not gonna let it stop me from enjoying this amazing episode. Another interesting thing is that Rick only has this drunk slobbering mouth once in the entire episode, and it's at the end, within the context of this weird breakup with Evil Morty. He's not just that way all the time anymore, he drinks intentionally, which I think is a huge step for not only him, but the show in general. I'm really hopeful for the move away from Rick just being a complete asshat for no fucking reason. I'm also strangely optimistic about the end of this episode, if only because it feels like by the time the show concludes, Evil Morty is going to have the most wild journey of any character. Cause he's busting out of prison, right? Undoubtedly, he isn't just gonna stay there. So he would have gone from classic adventures to controlling evil Rick, to being a displaced Morty, to being Citadel President, to breaking the finite curve, to killing Rick Prime, to claiming the Omega device, to eventually breaking out of time prison. And then whatever the hell happens after that. And I'm honestly so fucking here for it. I wouldn't be surprised surprised if it happens this season, actually. The point is, I'm optimistic and excited for what the future of Rick and Morty is going to churn out, and I can't remember the last time that happened. That was a journey, I know. There's a reason that the answer, "oh yeah, I stopped watching after a while," is so common in the Rick and Morty viewership. Repetitive one-side-favored nihilism is a tough pill to swallow time and time again. Sure, the show had different ideas to play with, but when every lesson amounts to nothing matters, you're stupid for caring, it's never different, at some point you start believing it. Rick and Morty was peddling nihilism in buckets, and when the audience started believing it, they left the show behind because it was a part of the nothing that mattered. If you're gonna play with such dangerous ideas, it's important to play responsibly. Maybe Rick and Morty was once interested in a fair coin flip between absurdism and nihilism, but over time, it started using a weighted dice. Stories ended up feeling like the same because the message behind them was the same. No nuance, no specificities to explore, just nothing fucking matters. Season 1 didn't have this problem, which is probably why people argued it was the best season. People who say that are usually the people who were watching during seasons 2 to 5, which is why the show makes note of it so often throughout those seasons. The reason season 1 felt so much better was because it wasn't trying to shove this nihilistic worldview down anyone's throats. Nearly every aspect of seasons 2 to 5, from the characters to the plot to the writers to the narrative itself, all pointed us in this repetitive direction of fuck you for caring. But season 6 started to change. It still felt prey to a lot of common repetitive problems of previous seasons, but it actually leaned on the side of Rick that truly cared about his grandson. It played around with Rick becoming an overall better person, and perhaps because of that, it played with nihilism in a way that felt more responsible and less haphazard. It had its cruel moments, sure, it wasn't devoid of nihilism, but what a great start it was. Then seasons 7 and 8 flourished those seeds beautifully, creating an entirely new dynamic that felt so similar to season 1 because it wasn't influenced by demanding the story play to a nihilistic angle. Unchaining itself from this worldview allowed classic Rick and Morty adventures again, the ones that didn't make me feel like shit when they were done. It's no wonder that so many of my top 5 episodes are from this era of the show. It's truly unfortunate that people seem to stop watching right before the show learned what the audience needed, before the show had a chance to learn from its overbearing nihilistic mistakes and work to be better. But in the end, isn't that really just Rick's story? Maybe the whole damn show, even the good and bad parts, are an allegory for Rick. Maybe the show needed to have a shitty middle part because it would help us appreciate how much it's grown, how much it's changed, how it's working to not repeat the same mistakes of the past. Or maybe I'm coping because I don't want to remember the show as repetitive, depressing nihilism. But now, I don't have to. I can start to remember the show not for Purge Planet, but for Juricki. I can start to let go of Vindicators 3 and think more on the Cryosleep episode. I can forget how spiteful the show was for showing us Rick's backstory and remember instead how superficially and profoundly cool that fight scene was with Rick Prime. I can start to get excited about Rick and Morty returning again. And thanks to 9-1, I already have. Because now, the show isn't just coming back for another season. It actually feels better now. Thank you so much for watching. What do you think? Do you agree with my takes, or am I totally off base about the health of this show? Special thanks to my patrons, their names are on the screen, and a huge thanks to my god tier patron, Sid Montoya. More videos coming soon, so keep an eye out and make sure you're subscribed. That's all I got for you right now. Bye.